Stand username, Gus Zagarella. Stand, Mermaid Avenue.
Stand username, Henry Galley. Stand, Throbbing Gristle.
And we are not alive.
Welcome, everybody. Those of us who love talking about writing advice are in for a treat today because we've got some really cool tips here from one of the most prolific, beloved, successful, and individual mangaka of all time, the one and only Hirohiko Araki of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
Oh, and let me tell you, I have been a fan of JoJo ever since I happened onto the latest anime adaptation. It is something that is so singular and so idiosyncratic, full of, amazing characters, incredible writing choices, and truly bizarre stories that are unlike anything else, even within its general sphere of shonen. And you brought the book.
Yeah, so we're coming at this from a really unique perspective in the Gus is a big JoJo's fan. I've never taken the plunge on JoJo's, but I am seriously considering it. If you would like me to do that and share my thoughts on it, bully me about it in the comments.
Bully Henry. Hashtag Bully Henry. He's healed now. You can bully him.
It's true. So while browsing one of my local bookshops here in Sydney, the wonderful, if very expensive, Kinokuniya, I've had a little book called Manga in Theory and Practice, The Craft of Creating Manga by Araki. It's essentially a awesome little book where he shares his sort of secret tricks of the trade from a lifetime in this really unique avenue of storytelling. If you are someone out there who, like me, was not super familiar with JoJo's, who, like me, has no artistic talent in terms of illustration whatsoever, don't click off, because me and Gus are both people who love writing here. We're writers ourselves. We have all our projects. They'll come up in the video, I'm sure. He, at the start of this book, says this can be applicable to anyone interested in learning about or improving their craft in storytelling, whether it's novels, movies, comics, manga, gaming, anything. And having read through the whole thing, I think in a single day, because it's such a fantastic page turner, full of just this clear, lucid, unique advice from a unique voice in the creative ecosystem, I wholeheartedly recommend it. I cannot wait to get into all of the kind of tips I've extracted from it, and I want to be completely clear here. While we are extracting tips from it to share with you and discuss and evaluate here, there is so much in the book that I'm not covering, and this video is in no way a replacement for the experience of reading the book. I massively recommend it. If you can, you go and get a copy yourself.
Yes, please do, because I know I'm going to. I'm just so excited to hear about it.
Then, why wait any longer? So, I have distilled, I think, for the benefit of us and for the benefit of our audience, kind of 14 sort of subheading sections that fall under, uniform tips here. And the first one is, interestingly, not even really a tip that he kind of has in the book itself, but a tip that is so clear just from reading between the lines of the different things he talks about in this book. Tip one, I would say, is that you need to experience art outside of the medium that you work in. To give you an example of that, throughout this book, Araki refers to different things, and I have written down just a handful of the stuff that he kind of discusses and analyzes here, just to give you an idea of the breadth of this dude's experience. So, just some. The book, Hitchcock/Truffaut. His inspiration from the field of sculpture and high art, Italian fashion, the novels of Seiichi Yokomizo, travel writing, Jules Verne, Clint Eastwood movies, Disney's Frozen, Kick-Ass 1 and 2, anime, Star Wars, ancient Greek myths, pop stars, Kurosawa movies, tarot cards, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck, and The Godfather Part 2.
So, if you're a JoJo head like me, a lot of lights are probably lighting up in your brain as you recognize different parts of the manga and anime in those various references, and other lights are lighting up for the first time as you think, oh, well, how did that influence JoJo's. Because the thing is, JoJo's very famously has a lot of characters that are named for various worldwide musicians, especially like, American rock musicians. And that is something that really you can only get away with due to Japan's copyright laws. And a lot of the early dubs and translations of JoJo's, they had to change so many different characters' names. One example that I know Henry's not familiar with, that's from one of the video games, is Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap changed to Filthy Deeds Accomplished at a Reasonable Price.
Which somehow seems so much more sinister.
I am so thinking about the way that Stardust Crusaders, which is the first one that is kind of like a globe-trotting adventure where they go country by country, you get so many like little like weird tidbits about like the different like cultures that they're experiencing, everything from like haggling to local delicacies to even like the way certain like bathrooms work. Like I forget exactly which country it was, but there's a place where like pigs will like, be connected to the bathroom via a trough, so they kind of like just like eat the waste. It's all this stuff that is like real facts about our world that has been like, nonetheless transposed onto the world of JoJo's, and makes, despite how heightened and strange it is, it feel all the more like a real experience for these characters.
Yeah, and we're going to get into even more of how he believes you should factor in real life and travel and like first-hand experience into creativity later. But I think it really goes to show the genuinely eclectic nature of Araki's art does come from being someone who pulls from such a diverse selection of sources. Like, I think it's so fascinating how I kind of mentioned in there, but I'll give some more detail on that. One of the things that even I, as someone who is kind of a novice in the JoJo's world, knows is that some of the most iconic things about those like panels is the way that he chooses to like pose the characters. They have very like iconic stances. And he says in the book, so much of that comes from him visiting fine art museums in Europe and looking at a lot of those classic Renaissance era marble statues, looking at the forms, looking at the poses. But then, like a page later, he'll be talking about the like kind of iconic like performance poses of like Michael Jackson and how that will like influence. And it just goes to show that the wider range of things that you draw inspiration from, and we're talking about truly wide range, not like Tarantino, who for the most part just takes from other movies, like being well read, well watched, loving fine art, loving like, I think honestly it can be said of Araki, this is a man who just loves culture.
No, it's true. And like he's found such beautiful ways to like synthesize like your statues and Michael Jackson example, two different things that nonetheless like do taste good together, but have not really been drawn together in any kind of like completely holistic way.
That in a sense is where originality comes from. Whether you love JoJo's or are deeply confused by it, which seems to be the kind of two reactions.
I think both is fair, like even if you're really deep into it, honestly.
It's true, but I think one thing that you simply categorically could not say about it is that it's unoriginal.
Yeah, absolutely not. No one would say that. I mean,
While he does throughout the book say it is really important to study manga to see like specific techniques of like, oh, what sells well, what has an impact, panel layout, story structure, that kind of thing, he never once says only slavishly produce this. Like, if you want to be a novelist, make sure you are listening to plenty of music and hitting up your local art galleries as well. If you want to make games or kind of audio dramas and weird new media stuff like me and Gus, make sure you've read the classic novels and have like watched Casablanca, Citizen Kane, and Seven Samurai. The more you can broaden what you experience, the deeper and richer your appreciation of art as a legacy will be, and the like more textured your art is going to be as a result, no matter what it is.
yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that because the foundation of all art is human experience, and there are nuances of that that like cannot just kind of be studied by like breaking down a historical tradition of a certain type of art within a certain medium, within a certain genre, within a certain subgenre. At a certain point, like studying up on that stuff just teaches you how to steal. Being broadly interested in the world and other art teaches you how to synthesize, like Araki does.
Exactly. But obviously, I think one of the huge appeals of this book, which I'm going to say the title again, it's Manga in Theory and Practice: The Craft of Creating Manga. If anyone wants to write that down for their lists, he also gives this very like deeply practical advice, which leads us on to tip two, which I have titled "Make Them Turn the First Page." And for this, I'm gonna read out some of the stuff from the book, which will give you a great idea of his very kind of like straightforward, no nonsense voice when he is in particular talking about the first page and the first panel, which even if you don't work in this manga world, any like narrative storytelling, first page of your screenplay, first page of your book, first like 5 minutes of your like indie animation, this is all stuff that you're going to want to hear. So, are you ready for the first part of his writing on this kind of make them turn the first page?
I'm ready. I think everyone out there is ready
You
too.
better be. All right, so he says here the five W's and one H, the foundation of the first panel. When I began making manga as a hobby, I drew my first pages without giving them much thought. But as I continued analyzing other works, I began to understand the fundamentals of the first panel. At the most basic level, the first panel should illustrate the five W's and one H. In other words, who is doing what, and when, and where, and why, and how. As a natural result of establishing the main character's location and the time at which the scene takes place, the first panel will likely be somewhat large, and often a depiction of the hero with buildings in the background. If you follow that pattern too closely, you will end up with a too familiar panel at too familiar size, even if you do manage to check off the basic 5W1H requirements. Since you mustn't draw the same things as other artists, you need to find something uniquely yours to capture the reader's attention. It was from this line of thinking that I began devoting conscious effort to devising ways of throwing in curveballs without abandoning the fundamentals. Since I enjoy suspense stories with mysteries to solve, I decided to apply those techniques in my manga. For example, I would start with a panel that leads the reader to question where the main character is, and then gradually pull back the viewpoint to reveal he's locked up in a hospital. As with the other elements of the first page, so too must you come up with a solution for the 5Ws and 1H that is a little bit different than manga that's come before, and in doing so, invite the reader's interest. How do you feel about that, Gus?
I think what he's saying here is to imagine yourself as the audience of the thing you're making. What would immediately stand out to you of like, this is interesting, and I'm not sure if I've seen this exact thing somewhere else before? Because I think too much familiarity, as he's laying out there, makes people sort of be like how many modern isekai basically have like the same beginning of like even
Truck-kun.
like, same guy getting hit with the truck. Yeah, and then like, generic waifu number one shows up. Maybe there's a little bit of like, buying a slave or like, fighting off, getting your first powerful weapon. Like those things as opening images don't always say that the show you're going to watch is like as bad or as, middling or as mediocre as other things that have also done that, but they also don't make them stand out to the point that I think that sometimes when things get too samey within a genre, you just kind of like feel like, yeah, I don't really know whether that was this one or that other one. Whereas a very strong, very distinct, idiosyncratic opening image does give people something that they can latch onto and be like, oh, I'm in a new world now.
Exactly, and I think this is something that you can see in so many different mediums. Like in novels, of course, there's often the thing of the iconic first line, whether it's the kind of elegant simplicity of the "Call Me Ishmael" in Moby Dick, or something that's as kind of like eerie and thinky as the first line in 1984. That is something like it was a cool, bright day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. That immediately hits you with a kind of like, all right, like you said, Gus, something is different here. And the same is true of movies. Two weird and very disparate examples is I think the opening minute of the movie Hereditary, directed and written by Ari Aster, for example, which opens on this very eerie shot of a treehouse with Colin Stetson's kind of like creeping, like brass tones in the background, and then a slow pan through Annie's workshop to this big like scale model diorama of a house that as the like it slowly zooms in on the bedroom, we get people walking into it and it becomes the house. Or a very different example, and something that feels so Araki in spirit, a movie that both me and Gus love, and we'd love to talk about either on here or the Patreon at some point. The movie Shoot 'Em Up with Clive Owen, which opens with Clive Owen sort of sitting on a park bench looking cool. A woman carrying a baby is chased down the street by two armed men, and before getting up and pursuing the men, Clive Owen pulls out an unpeeled carrot and starts munching on it like Bugs Bunny before like heading into hot pursuit. And it's those little choices, like Araki was saying, the kind of conscious swerves that makes people think, "Oh, what's going on here?" that makes something iconic.
It's so true. Those are like such like, distinctive moments. Even after you've seen the movie, coming back to those moments, you're like, this really sets like such a unique tone. But even going beyond like traditional storytelling mediums like novels and movies to another medium that I know Araki appreciates, music can begin with like these like very distinctive riffs or like opening notes. And like you'll feel the whole song playing out in your head the second time you listen to something with a really distinct musical note. Like an example that I can say, but not necessarily like replicate because, YouTube has certain rules against that. But the songs of Tom Petty, if I hear the beginning of Learning to Fly, instantly I am like in there in that entire song and I'm just like, yes. Like and that's the thing is that like make sure the beginning of it is interesting and distinctly itself. People aren't going to know what the body is going to be like, but they are going to be like that's the beginning of something unique.
Yeah, it's true in many ways, and he describes it as a preview, but in some ways, I sometimes think it's helpful to say the first scene is almost a kind of advert for what comes next. Like in my own show, the audio drama Kill Jam Triple X that me and Addison Peacock show run, the first scene of that, it's a very like absurd violent death game thing, and in the opening moments, a kind of big, scary but kind of hot wolf woman played by Autumn Ivy rips out someone's throat, and the commentators, played by Gus and friend of the show Jasper Taylor, make banter about this like horrific murder they've just seen. And even before Faustina, the main character, shows up, I think that opening moment that we spent a lot of time like editing and mathing out sells this. Oh, okay, this is a world where not only like weird, absurd violence occurs, but people are like utterly numb to it.
It ties back into ultimately what Araki's work does so well, and I think what other people who are trying to sort of take this tip and make it their own can learn from it, is that don't be afraid to jump right to the most fascinating thing that you can think of about your work. Like, don't be afraid to broadcast, hey, I've got some wild ideas, and here's one of them. So come with me based on this, and maybe you'll see where this is going, and what other ideas I can add to the mix.
I couldn't agree more. And before we leave tip two, Araki has another really awesome little practical tip here that is also, from everything I know, so quintessentially Araki, to the extent that I know Gus is going to laugh when I'm reading this, but it is good advice. He says, "The next skill I worked to acquire was how to serve many goals in a single drawing. Let me give a single line of dialogue as an example. Quote, I think I'll make pasta tonight. End quote. From this sentence, I can communicate a range of information about this character to the reader. The character likes Italian food. The character does their own cooking. The character likely lives alone and not with family or significant other. The character does not live in utter poverty. The dialogue can work in conjunction with the character's hairstyle and clothing to convey much of the protagonist's circumstances and personality in a single glance. Drawing a unique kitchen as the background would instantly tell the reader that something was different about this character."
Man, like I'll be real. If I had a nickel for every time pasta was plot important in Jojo, I might almost have $1. I'm not even exaggerating.
You would have enough to actually buy some pasta.
Exactly.
But again, as hilarious and I would say incredibly endearing as Araki's like complete adoration for Italy and everything associated with it is, it's also fantastic advice. And this is something that if you find it a little intimidating, don't worry. It's something that you can improve through editing in subsequent drafts. But the more kind of dense information that you can convey about a character through like every line, every frame, every moment, kind of regardless of medium, the quicker an audience member is going to know whether what you're doing here is for them or not, and it won't be for everyone, and that's okay. But the sooner that the people who love it can realize that it's the kind of thing they're gonna love, the better. You'll have done yourself and them a huge favor by seeking out that level of density.
Yeah, I think it's like just convey honestly. Like, don't have the opening moments of your thing be a disguise that the rest of it is wearing. Have the opening moments be the face of this whole thing.
Yeah, hook people as early as you can because at the end of the day, the last thing you want is to seem like one thing and then potentially be another, and the people who thought they were going to love it are immediately turned off because, again, that's a huge bummer for them, and that's a huge bummer for you. So, yeah, I think this is all just very solid advice from Araki here, and it leads us to tip 3. This is a bit of a shorter one, but it's really valuable for kind of everything that follows because Araki has what he calls the 4 fundamentals, and those are character, story, setting, and theme.
You know, this might be the first time I've ever heard those four fundamental. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, I think it is important to have those in mind as a writer. Clearly, he does.
Well, I think it's what he really stresses is balance. What is really interesting about Araki, and it's something that a lot of other theorists on writing, like John Truby, really agree with, is this idea that the other 3, character, story, and setting, are all encompassed within theme. And theme, or as John Truby calls it, the guiding principle, has to kind of be your North Star for everything else. And again, it's something I really agree with because I think knowing what your themes are, knowing what you're trying to say, is the best way to know whether an idea you've had for like whatever you're doing fits or not. But I'm going to let him explain himself here with just a short section called Balance the 4 elements, which appropriately sounds extremely anime. Okay, so he says here, as you can see, it is certainly possible to create a manga that focuses on one of the 4 fundamental elements. There's nothing unusual about a manga lacking in story becoming a smash hit based on the appeal its characters hold, while some manga focus entirely on their stories and others on their settings. The goals of each work are up to each mangaka, as is how to convey them through drawings. But manga with one element that drastically stands out from the rest will always be limited in some way. To overcome that limit, the other elements are needed. In order to create a manga that will become a classic read across generations, the balance between the 4 fundamentals is incredibly important. If you examine works that are currently considered masterpieces, you'll see that the 4 major fundamentals of manga structure are all in order. Even if your goal requires focus on a single element, you must remain mindful that you are still keeping a balance.
No, you know what? Like, I think put like that, I get a lot more where he's coming from. Because in truth, like, while there's a lot of discussion, and we sometimes fall into it too, about like being character driven writers versus story driven creators, or like, works that like kind of coast along based on their world building, or like, the contentious idea of things that just exist for their themes but execute nothing else about them correctly. All of this stuff kind of neglects the fact that nothing needs to be extremely like lopsidedly specialized in any one of these 4. Like, there's no reason to neglect the other 3 just because one of them catches your fancy. Again, goals vary, as he says, but all of these are your friends. All of these are tools in your belt, and you have access to all of them, and you're allowed to do as much of each of them as you feel is necessary.
Exactly. I think he's fundamentally saying that It's okay to have a favorite as long as nothing gets neglected. Like, if you are a huge world building head, like, your main goal is to create a, like, deeply vivid setting that people can get lost in. And if that is your goal, you'll be happy to know he's got some great stuff on that we'll be getting into later. But if that's your focus, it doesn't mean that it's an excuse to have straight up boring characters or a meandering plot. Ditto, if you are a character first writer, the onus is still on you to try to make the setting interesting and the plot be something that gets the best out of your characters. Because at the end of the day, they are all connected. Because if you have a cast of amazing characters, but you don't have like a plot or a premise or a world that lets them strut their stuff as best as they can, you've done yourself out of it here. Like, for example, like Walter White is a really great iconic character, but him becoming like a meth cook, that's the plot. If he never did that, he wouldn't be that interesting a character.
It's very true. And also, like, one more thing before we move on to the next tip. I think that, like, it is important to remember, because a lot of people on the internet especially kind of forget this, is that themes do have a place at the table. And the instinct to kind of ignore them or treat them as something that is, like, immaterial or something that is decided after the fact, I think that comes from the fact that they are not, like, as tangible as the other ones. Like, a setting must take place. Characters must exist. The plot is literal cause and effect. But themes elude people, I think, because they are inherently less literal. But I actually think that is part of their power. And to neglect them or to say that, like, they are not as real as the characters or setting or events of your plot is to dismiss the fact that everything else in it is also equally an idea.
Yeah, I think the way it can sometimes be helpful to think of it, and if you are someone who has always like struggled with theme, we're not looking down on you or anything because it can be extremely squirrely.
Like, I think if you're struggling with any of the four of these, there's no reason to like look down on you at all. I think it's just like, if you clearly know that one of these things is less of a priority to you, don't get like, weird about people who it is a priority for. And also don't feel like you always have to be bad at it or that you have to be a specialist in something that isn't it.
Exactly, and I think the way I would maybe kind of describe theme in a metaphorical sense is think of it like chi or prana or the force, or if you want to get real weird with it, vril. It's this kind of like it's an energy that pervades and allows everything else to happen in that kind of mystical sense. It's always there. It's the air that we breathe.
It's energico,
It's the
baby.
Energico. Speaking of getting all Energicoized, that brings us to tip 4, which, talking about the kind of fundamentals, and the following tips are sort of arranged into those fundamentals, we are in the realm of character now, and there is no denying there are some absolutely iconic characters that Araki has created. Like, characters that he wrote back in the 80s that are still thriving elements of kind of like online and meme culture to this day.
Well, yeah, and even like the obscure ones still have fascinating aura to them. Like, I mentioned Tom Petty's music earlier in this video because there's a character in part 1 of Jojo who is a Tibetan monk named Ton Petty, who is a master of the Hamon technique and the teacher to both Dyer and Straits.
He was smoking that shit that made Tom Petty. I stole that from Al Miller, who was on Dribble Fails once. Hi Al, if you're watching this. This brings us to tip 4, which is good characters need strong motivation. And he's written some really interesting stuff on this. He says, once you've been convinced that characters are incredibly important and that you mustn't imitate established characters, the next step before you begin drawing is to form a mental image of your characters with all the necessary pieces in place. The most important part of a character is their motivation. What does your protagonist want to accomplish? If you can't clearly communicate their motives through their actions, he or she is not a complete character. Obviously, he said he or she but it's being translated from Japanese. We obviously observe theys and neopronouns. I'm just writing it as it's written down.
And also, like, just to clarify anyway, like, Japan doesn't have pronouns in that same way anyway. So, like, it's not even like he's being that reductive.
It's true.
Necessarily.
I just wanted to be clear there because I know that we have a very queer fan base.
And I think it's appreciated.
Okay, so it's crucial that you be able to illustrate why your characters act the way they do. If you leave your characters' motives vague, your readers won't be able to empathize with them. Returning to Dragon Ball's Goku as an example, his motivation is to become stronger and stronger. It's a simple motivation that's easy to understand and has been shared by every boy, which then makes room for deeper examination. Why does he want to become stronger? What will he do when he does? Because of this, readers can connect with the character and share in the emotional highs and lows. When it comes to creating characters, it may seem natural to begin with their personalities, but you have to be able to show the readers within the first or maybe second page what purpose that character possesses for being in the story. If your main character is a superhero, start by considering why the character became a superhero. If the character starts acting like a superhero without having a clear motive, the reader's first reaction will be, what the hell is this character doing? And they won't come along for the story. The motivation could be anything. His parents were killed by evildoers. He wants to get a woman. She has a fatal and incurable disease, and she's gonna die anyway, so she might as well die a hero. Or even simply that she was bored. As you keep thinking of possible motivations, you're looking for the one that feels the strongest and most interesting to you. And rather than stopping there, I'm quickly going to read out the next bit where he goes into slightly more detail on what makes a good motivation, because I think it'll enhance the overall discussion. So he says, your character's motivations have to gain the interest and empathy of your readers. A good motivation is one that makes the reader wonder what will happen to that character and what the character will do, because the reader will want to keep reading. What you have to realize in the instance of shonen manga magazines is that those motivations will always be attuned to the reader's natural sense of ethics. The three principles of Shonen Jump are friendship, effort, and victory. Likewise, shonen manga readers will strongly empathize with what they feel is good and right, and will reject what they feel is unethical. Because of this, characters such as Death Note's Light Yagami, who kills again and again even though the targets of his assassinations are criminals themselves, require skillful technique for the mangaka to win over the readers. On the reverse side, characters who are 100% virtuous can come across as fake and unlikable. To avoid this, you need to include in your main character's weaknesses or faults or human desires. Even if the main character's motives are well defined, cowardly acts will still repulse your readers. This is mostly because cowardice is in direct opposition to the morality of your audience. Readers will never empathize with a gutless hero who sacrifices innocent bystanders to save his own life. Similarly, if your protagonist is in a tough situation because he blundered into it, your readers will judge the character as a fool and will only react with antipathy. How do you feel about all that?
I broadly agree with everything Araki is saying, and I encourage everyone who, like, hasn't already or hasn't in a while, if you want a crash course in how Araki puts this all into practice, I cannot recommend anything higher than, like, the first few, like, episodes slash chapters of JoJo's Part 1, Phantom Blood, with the interactions between Jonathan Joestar and Dio Brando. Because both of these boys are really so driven by what they want. Jonathan wants to be with, like, his young crush. He wants to be loved by his family, by his father. He wants to grow up into a man that, like, the society that he lives in can be proud of. And meanwhile, Dio also wants all of that, but because he began in a different place, he wants to take it from Jonathan, who he sees as this, like, embodiment of everything, all the privilege that he was never allowed to have. And these two guys, even before, like, vampires, zombies, supernatural powers, well before, decades before stands were even anywhere in this story, you see all of that. They're brothers, they're enemies, they're friends, they're everything. And it all comes down to their motivation and how it plays out.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think what's really interesting and kind of connected to this is I would say rather than take from this, oh, well, the solution is you need to always kind of make your hero like a brave, virtuous badass, kind of like you're saying there. I think reading between the lines, with everything that he said about these are the rules specifically for writing a Shonen Jump manga in his perspective, um, I think the more constructive piece of advice to take here is that you need to think about the traits that the audience you're going for will find admirable and compelling, right in line with that. Like you said, consider the kind of ethical framework of your audience.
Yeah, and I think the thing is too, and you see this in a lot of shonen manga, which I think broadly, he's referring to here, like multiple times. He calls out that this is like the way it works in shonen manga in particular. You'll see a lot of characters who start their story making virtuous decisions, decisions that are interesting, but the outcomes that result on that are not always like, what they wanted. Whether it's because they don't have sufficient strength to carry out what they're trying to do, or that the solution that they pick, even though they think it's the right one at the time, was actually a reckless or maladjusted one. There is like always a way to like make a character feel like they are like ethically palatable to the audience, but still imperfect, still needing to learn. What if that was met with the power and strength of the hero they could become?
Yeah, and as well, linking to this, if all of this has you thinking, okay, yes, these are interesting tips, these could enhance my protagonist, but like where can I start? He offers a really cool exercise here where he recommends literally as you are building your characters before doing anything else, make a list of motivations that you or the audience might find sympathetic without narrowing it down to begin with, just making a list. And examples he gives are things like self protection, of social status or privilege, feelings or memories, suppressing a scandal, hiding evidence of a crime, to protect a loved one, family or lover, friend, etc., work, duty, patriotism, curiosity, then in parenthesis, a mangaka looking for a story idea, a collector self discovery, vengeance, desires for money, sex, love, power, etc., pursuit of happiness, freedom of expression, political freedom, to become strong, to meet a hero, to make others laugh, to find something that is missing, etc. And like literally just making this big list and considering what kind of fits with that. And he has this really interesting offshoot of that here that says basic human desires as motivations. And underneath is written, if you create a list of motivations, you'll probably notice that almost all stem from basic human desires. But keep in mind that, as I said above, in order to gain the empathy of your readers, you need agreeable motivations that conform to their natural sense of ethics. For example, if the motivation is a desire for wealth, you need to work it so that rather than being a simple robber, the character needs money in order to save someone else. Readers will be able to root for your main character's search for vengeance, despite it being an antisocial motivation, when the goal is to take out an evil that is beyond the reach of the law or authorities. The period drama television series Hisatsu, Sure Death, provides a good example. The main characters are hired killers of bad people, and when the viewers begin to accept that their targets are so bad that getting the law involved just isn't necessary, the assassins take on the role of justice, and the audience becomes able to cheer them on. But if the viewers are ever given room to think, why not just go to the police, they're being selfish, then revenge will fall apart as a motivation. Infidelity is also antisocial, but if you depict it not just as raw sexual desire, but as something that is wrong but a relatable temptation, readers will think, yeah, that's how it is, but it isn't going to end well for the two of them. The emotional connection will bring readers closer to the characters. A good example of this can be found in the movie Unfaithful 2002, where Diane Lane's character commits adultery. That, I think, is like a bunch of really interesting stuff, because what he's described there, I feel like, is the underpinnings for more insanely popular characters and franchises like Dexter and The Punisher.
Yeah, well, not only that, but like, going back to the example of like, part one of his own manga, a lot of that stuff is why Dio himself is so interesting. It's not just that we're like seeing the traits in Jonathan that would inspire us to want him to be able to actualize his ethics and grow into the man that will one day, be like, the hero of this manga. We're also seeing all of the things that motivate Dio. His poverty, his, need for this kind of wealth, his want to be a respectable person, his want to be better than his father. Even his covetous possession of Jonathan's crush comes from this place of wanting to fit into society. And later on, as he starts to like breach more and more human ethics, and, in the way a Guillermo del Toro villain might, ultimately abandons his humanity in a very like visceral moment, we are shown that the path that him and Jonathan are on diverge. It wouldn't have been as compelling if Araki didn't plant them both with deeply human motivations and have their battle, both of body and of spirit, be so thoroughly grounded in human experience.
It's so funny that you bring that up because I'm going to move straight on because tip 5 is advice on creating and getting the most out of iconic villains.
Like you and Dio Brando may be just one of the most iconic like manga and anime villains ever. He's like Araki knows what he's doing here, and I cannot wait to hear what his tip on villains is.
So he has a few really cool things to say on that. From the man's own words, under the subheading, The Allure of Evil Characters, he says, on the other hand, humans aren't always pure and good, but carry an ugly side within themselves. It's just that in normal life, morals, laws, and other rules of the world keep those baser natures from display. When an evil character freely exhibits those normally hidden desires and acts in a way the readers could not, the readers find great catharsis. In the first story arc of Jojo, I always intended to make Dio look cool as he charged headlong down the villain's path, but I think it's due to that catharsis that some readers took to the character with incredible zeal. By providing an outlet for the ugly feelings that we all share, you can depict a more lifelike range of emotions than those of only goodness, and in doing so, you can effectively evoke readers' empathy. If you can create a truly evil character, your manga will be more likely to become a classic. That said, being able to get readers to empathize with ugly desires is a tremendously tall hurdle, one that requires thought and planning to overcome. Once you have that ability, you can turn even a heartless killer into your main character. In Dio's case, I depicted him as coming from an unfortunate upbringing, saddled with a father who had no redeeming qualities whatsoever. I gave him a background that could explain his hunger for power and his willingness to become evil incarnate to obtain it. Dio wanted to get revenge upon the world for his terrible lot in life, even if it meant taking an evil path and committing deeds contrary to morality and law. In the end, I think readers were able to accept that.
And that they were. Because the thing is, that foundation allows Dio to, even as he goes further and further into supervillainy, to being a multi-general nemesis to the Joestar family, to having his bloodline even show up in later parts in unexpected ways, to even appearing again in an alternate universe of the original JoJo's timeline, it really allows, no matter how high he goes, no matter how much he yes-ands himself, he'll always be this character that on some level people can imagine being or find some kind of catharsis in. Weirdly enough, it does almost relate broadly to what we discussed in our video on The Painter about the term trauma bitch.
Yeah, in our video on The Painter, which I really recommend checking out, even if you haven't seen that series, because I think we had some really cool discussions in there. We spoke a lot about that series' villain, Mona Lanius, who is a completely, like, irredeemable monster who is, like, a total sadist, willing to, like, kill and torture and abuse anyone to fulfill her, like, sick kicks and sort of artistic desires, and how a lot of people latched onto that character, especially queer women, because even though she was like a completely deplorable being, she spoke to that sense of the like, hey, do you ever want to go crazy? Do you ever just want to fucking lose it? That I think is this kind of undercurrent to some of the frustrations and restrictions of modern life. And I think that's a great thing to do with villains. I can say from personal experience, again, I'll use Killjam as an example just because you can go listen to it and hear it in practice. The main villain of that, Mr. Dirge, for a period, I was in a middle management position, and the part of me that was like, man, I'm the only human in a Muppet movie. Why can't people just follow the things I'm saying? That I sort of blew out of proportion to create the kind of like ultimate bad boss who will just like break people's necks or throw them out of windows for annoying him. Because who has not been in a position at some point in a job where they have felt a little bit like murdering their co-workers.
What is so beautiful about like villains like this that can employ this technique of having like really relatable foundations is that when they start to go like even further beyond where like like the reader's ethics would take them, they become more compelling villains by how little those foundations justify what their actions are. You can look at them and you can be like, this is a truly despicable human being, even with the bad things that have happened to them. You know what? It's a video about manga, so I'm gonna invoke it again. There's a character in Medaka Box who I think is a fascinating manga villain, Kumagawa Misogi, who is the ultimate minus in that he is a character who is incapable of winning or accomplishing anything. He is like the ultimate loser. He wants to remove the idea of people being winners or virtuous or ethical in any way. Because of the lengths he will go, you're almost like, if you would just roll over and be a loser, we wouldn't hate you. But because you try and make everyone like go down to your level, you're truly a monster. But the manga really reckons with this contradiction between, can Kumagawa be saved? Or is even trying to save him dragging yourself into his nonsense?
I've never read Medaka Box, but from everything you've told me about it, I bet Brad Bird loves it. Because
You know what?
it's
I
so
think
his kind
I'll
of like
take that.
weird,
Yeah, yeah.
like it's very like Ayn Randian, the very like, look, some people are just special and you gotta get out of their way. Which I can't say is a view I
Well,
necessarily ascribe to myself, but it's interesting for art to explore it.
I could talk about Medaka Box for a lot longer than this, and we've got a different idiosyncratic wild manga from a different idiosyncratic wild creator to get back to. So, if you don't mind, Henry
Which,
Galley, what is the next
well,
tip?
it does actually connect to the second part of the kind of villain thing, which is contrast the hero and villain, where he says, no matter how compelling Dio was as an embodiment of evil, the protagonist of Jojo's first story was not him, but rather the just Jonathan. Similarly, your main character must be fundamentally virtuous, on the side of justice. Then, in parenthesis, what justice is can be left up to personal interpretation. True to their friends and brave. These are three qualities to me that are most beautiful manifestations of the human spirit, and the overwhelming majority of readers will empathize with and root for virtuous protagonists. If you set out to create an antagonist that is an opposite to the main character, like Mitsuru Hanagata versus Hyomi Hoshi in Kyojin no Hoshi, Star of the Giants, the contrast between good and evil will be made more vivid. With Jonathan and Dio, I base the characters off the duality between light and shadow, and use black and white contrasts in my drawing to set them apart. But sometimes the difference between good and evil may depend on your reader's viewpoints. As I've grown older, I've found that good and evil are not so easily delineated, and I've taken more interest in the reasons why people do bad things. In the JoJo arc Steel Ball Run, the major villain is the deeply patriotic President Valentine, and from that perspective, his stated goals may be more just. In fact, I suspect his intentions line up with those of our real world leaders. But he's willing to sacrifice powerless people to achieve just ends, and that part of his character is, to the minds of the protagonist and the reader, unquestionably and unforgivably evil. Because of this, the character of President Valentine could never be the protagonist. I think this also serves as a good example of a point I made earlier, that readers won't empathize with a coward. So, okay, I think I need to, before we like kind of discuss this, I need to acknowledge some caveats here, I think.
Right.
So obviously it goes without saying that we as like creators and as people who also love art and culture, we have tremendous respect for Araki as just a creator and a thinker and everything. But it doesn't mean that we'll necessarily always line up with him. And I will say that while clearly a lot of his opinions here come from having a very like well formed and specific creative ethos and a viewpoint on life, I can also say that I feel like ultimately I could not wholeheartedly endorse this rule when I know that I personally love so many things that are exceptions to it. Nightcrawler, American Psycho, The Irishman, The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, as we mentioned earlier. Like all of these different things, and obviously you have things like Mr. In Between or Peaky Blinders, where the main characters are like objectively more like virtuous, principled rogues. Sometimes, if they're written compellingly, you want to follow, in the words of Limmy, a right bad bastard as your protagonist.
I completely agree with what you're saying because, like, just intuitively, I know there are protagonists that I have enjoyed that are neither brave nor necessarily true to their friends. Those might be qualities that they get further down the line, but it isn't the qualities that made them, like, cool and relatable to begin with. A brave character who is true to their friends is probably, to a lot of people, you can't go wrong with it if you're trying to be safe and, like, reach a broader audience. But I don't think all artistic goals always point to that being the right choice, depending on what story you're trying to tell.
Yeah, and again, obviously, to be completely fair to him, he is talking first and foremost about what the majority reader expectations of the Shonen Jump audience would want. Araki, from his philosophy, he would never write Uncut Gems, he would never write The Big Lebowski, he would never write Goodfellas, and those are three of my favorite movies of all time, so I can't just blindly co-sign this rule.
And also, like, I will say that, like, while they're not the protagonists of any of their given parts, there are, like, cowardly or, like, doofus characters or characters that aren't, like, the best of friends to other members of the JoJo's crew of, like, the given part that they're in. And those can sometimes, in their little side stories and subplots, be the most compelling characters. Jean-Pierre Paul Naref, the cowardly Frenchman himself, throughout most of Stardust Crusaders, will get into all kinds of, like, shenanigans that don't always paint him as a likable guy, but he is always interesting because he's always on some, like, wild bullshit. Meanwhile, Jotaro is, like, a little bit more cool as a cucumber and generally does the right thing and has very few vices other than, like, teenage smoking.
Yeah, and while I think that tip is primed to inevitably be contentious, because, it was even contentious with us, he saves it, in my opinion, with the next thing we get to, which is a wonderfully practical tip on a thing that you watching this at home can do to better flesh out your characters. Tip 6: Character histories, the secret ingredient.
Very intriguing.
Alright, I'm gonna read it as he says here. When I'm creating a new character, before I do any drawing, I always write a character history. I have done so for over 40 years, since before Jojo appeared in print. To me, it's something akin to a chef's secret seasoning. It protects against inconsistencies in the character. For example, if a character is established as being unathletic, but in a fight he is suddenly nimble. It's like how if you look at a person's resume and see a gap between the years that causes you to wonder what that person was doing during that time, or how a wedding seating chart can tell you how much about the couple and their families. And then I'm just going to skip a few pages ahead because he has a diagram. Lots of diagrams in this book. Another reason why it's really worth getting your hands on a physical copy, because there's a lot that you simply cannot communicate through a YouTube video. Anyway, what do they have different surnames? Or, I didn't know they had so many siblings. Or, the bride and groom's sides are really unbalanced. In a similar way, writing a character history can help you visualize a character's intangible traits. It's critical that your readers understand your characters at a single glance, and as you write a character history, you will naturally form an image for how that character should be drawn. It may lead you to the story, too. For example, when you come up with an answer to the fears section, you'll have a basis for a horror manga story. I got the idea to create these character histories from hearing about preparations Hollywood actors do for their roles. An actor playing the part of a police officer might go to a police academy and learn how to move and act like a real professional. The audience can tell in an instant whether something feels natural or not, and actors must strive to avoid giving performances that will shatter the suspension of disbelief. But when the details come across as real, they become a powerful tool to bring the role to life. With manga, if your editors have to ask you what a character is supposed to be, you haven't properly conveyed the character. To avoid this, you must have sufficient grasp of the character for yourself. Some elements of mystery are, of course, acceptable, but you must have a thorough understanding of what kind of person the character is.
Yeah, you definitely want a character to feel like they've existed before the very second we see them, like, appearing in the plot. Unless this is some, like, existential extended story where we follow every second of their life from their very birth to their very death
The
at the end
Bilgans
of, like, a
Roman.
long life. There will always be a moment of that is behind them in their past that is a backstory. And the more that you can have that be, like, in your mind, in the broad strokes filled out, the more this character doesn't seem like they don't know anything, or they're just, like, asking random questions, or like their skill set and interests fluctuate wildly from scene to scene. God, there's examples I could give, but they'd be too mean, and also they've been run into the ground by other YouTubers.
Yeah, so we won't go there, but what I will say, and what I, funnily enough, don't think he really discusses here, is it's a delicate dance. Because in my experience, and I'm not excluding myself from this because I think everyone falls into it sometimes with some projects. In my experience, there are two kinds of flaws that a writer can have. Number one is that characters have no history whatsoever. They are these very blank slates that were clearly kind of spawned and dropped into the world almost like a sim, and that can lead to kind of very unsatisfying inconsistent characters. The other flaw at the opposite end is when all of the coolest and most interesting stuff a character does exists purely in their backstory, and they don't do anything nearly as compelling in the actual story.
Yes, yes, and that sucks. That sucks because in the story, you want, like, whatever history you give the character to inform why the things we are seeing them do on screen and of consequence in the moment to moment action of the story are cool and awesome. That is the only reason that you should have a history. Or, like, for whatever goal you're going with, the history should only inform, like, the stuff that's happening. In a story where nothing is happening presently, and it's all the backstory, forget about it. I've played D&D campaigns before with somebody who, like, level 1 campaign, and they show up with a 3-page document of their character's backstory. And it's like, how has this much adventuring happened at level 1? Give us a break. This is a novice character. We're all weak. We're all going into this on level 1. You can't have your character have, like, resurrected a, like, 1,000-year-old ancient dragon with a magic spell that they could cast, because they can't cast that spell. And I think that can be translated into, like, anything. Like, that can be translated into, like, anything else, where it's just like, okay, but, like, how come the character in their backstory is an ultimate Giga Chad, but the character we see now is like a wet noodle?
I'm going to give two examples here, both from very popular, like, prestige TV shows, in that I think one does it right and one does it wrong. This is maybe the nichest thing. It will either mean nothing or everyone to everyone hearing this, so I won't dwell on it. Example of it being done really well. Mike Ehrmantraut in the Breaking Soul universe. Example of it being done badly with essentially exactly the same character archetype transposed into a different genre. Barristan Selmy in Game of Thrones. Because
Oh
I
my,
know, but yeah,
yeah,
you bet
you're
you didn't
right.
expect to hear Barristan Selmy brought up today, but here we are in this video about Hirohiko Araki's writing advice, but it's relevant. I think he'd appreciate it. But Mike is a character who, for people who aren't familiar with the Breaking Soul universe, he is a fixer and hitman for various kind of criminal forces. He's sort of like a stone cold, like, old, honorable kind of embodiment of the cliche old phrase, fear an old man in a profession where men die young. He was a sniper in the Vietnam War and then, like, a corrupt Philadelphia cop before becoming this, like, absolutely ace criminal who can, like, think himself out of any situation and is, like, so cool and so interesting. And Barristan Selmy should be that. And from what I've heard, in the books of A Song of Ice and Fire, is that. But in the show, they are constantly implying that he's like done really cool stuff and is this really like respected knight and like people are scared of him, but he gets to do like maybe one or two cool things in the narrative before being like cut down, and it's something that I know is particularly bizarre because the actor who played Barristan Selmy was like a fan of the books, and he was like, "Oh, with the stuff this season's getting into, I'm gonna have some really cool stuff to like sink my teeth into." But they killed him in the show way earlier than the book, so he feels like this dude who's like kind of in universe aura of coolness was completely unearned, whereas Mike has that kind of cool old guy balance of having a backstory that justifies being like a cunning badass, but also constantly doing cunning badass things in the story.
So true. And I think like to bring it back to anime, like what Barristan Selmy essentially is if it like we heard everything about Satoru Gojo up until the first fight he has with Jogo, and Jogo domain expands and then just bodies him right then and there. And we're like, what? But it seemed like you were winning. It seemed like you were doing okay. All right. Okay, I guess that's a series wrap on Satoru
This would
Gojo.
make Araki cry, but wouldn't it be the funniest thing, an alternate version of this story? Where, like, because Gojo brings Yuji in to, like, demonstrate, and Jogo does domain expand, and Gojo's like, oh, what the fuck is this? I didn't know he could do this. What is this? I've never heard of this technique. Yuji, we need to run. It's literally
Devastating.
that little comic, and please put it on screen, because it's one of my favorite ever, where it's like the guy going Super Saiyan, and he's like, I can feel the
Yes!
power! Master, what's happening to me?
Master, what
And the
is
master
this?
goes, I don't know. That's scary.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And that's and like the juxtaposition in that comic, the idea of like someone who is like built up enough, unless it is like, done as a gag, should not be like undermined immediately. Otherwise, the like idea of making them a cool badass was kind of a wasted moment.
Yeah, unless you're doing a
Unless
joke like this is I
it
hate this is the example, but Elijah Wood as the guy in Spy Kids 3.
No, it's true. It's true. Or also, if like, you're trying to show that the character or force that destroys that character that was built up is just that much more powerful. Like, for example, in Kengan Ashura, which is a manga series and an anime on Netflix, there are so many moments where you will go into a fight and you will basically just be getting like backstory of these two different characters that you have never seen fight before. And sometimes the one who you like didn't expect or you knew least about manages to topple the other one despite you knowing about more of their history. For example, two words, Devil Lance. If you know, you know. There are certain characters who almost build a mythos out of just saying the narrative might be fixated on these other characters, but that doesn't mean they were ready for me.
Yeah, I think it's called the Worf effect on TV tropes, and in the world of pro wrestling, it is known as jobbing. Having one character kind of get stomped to establish how seriously another character needs to be taken, and it can get a little cheap if you do it too much. But if you deploy it correctly, it can be insanely effective.
Yeah, I think the best uses of the Worf effect, because like the trope namer is how Worf in Star Trek would just get beaten up by everything because usually like violence couldn't solve a lot of the problems in those episodes. So him being the big strong guy meant that his role was to show that being a big strong guy couldn't help out most of the time. But where it works, I think, in stories that let a character seem strong by beating a strong person, is if you show the character they overcome having a track record of victories up until that point. Because then it really does feel like momentum has swung in a completely different direction rather than an almost recurring running gag-esque element just being executed again. Pour one out for my boy Yasutora Sato from Bleach. I can't even imagine him
The
losing.
sheer number of deep cut like anime and manga references throughout the if you love this, by the way, if you are one of the small minority who does love hearing us talk about anime, if you join the Patreon for $1 a month, not only will you get to hear me and Gus geek out about our love of Chainsaw Man Part 1 up to the Reze movie, you can also hear about the incredibly cursed live action film Sky Hoshi Anime Girl, discussed by Gus and friend of the channel Rocky from the Nullbird YouTube channel.
Yeah, we're getting into all kinds of anime this year. Most especially like with this video. I think this is we're putting a new step forward to like see like, hey, are people going to listen to us yap about Japanese animated shows? I think this year they
I
might.
mean, the thing is, as we discuss a lot in that thing, and then we'll get back to kind of the last tip of the character section. Anime is something that's been a really like inspirational force for me in these last few years because, like, for those who haven't listened to it, Kill Jam is basically anime meets pro wrestling meets savage critique of the entertainment industry. And I think the kind of unique aesthetics and storytelling and character ideas of anime have been a really creatively invigorating thing for me and Addison and the other writers working on that show. And if you love all the stuff we're discussing here, it's all the more reason that we recommend you go check out Killjam Triple X here on YouTube or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you like to listen to stuff. It's a good time. Ladies with superpowers killing each other, big characters, big villains.
Big boobies.
Yes. Or if you want something that is a little bit kind of more magical and plays with that period setting, like the first two parts of JoJo's, where people have different powers, and even Dracula shows up at one point, which feels not dissimilar to Jack the Ripper being a villain in JoJo's Part 1, you should really check out the Kingmaker histories, where we are made by the same team with showrunner Meg Tooten, which has 3 seasons out at the moment. That's over 30 episodes you can go and enjoy. We're crowdfunding for season 4 at the moment if you want to toss a few coins in our pot. But yeah, no, when we talk about all this stuff, please do bear in mind that it comes from the fact that people like Araki genuinely inspire us to make our shit, and we really recommend you check it out if you want signs and inspiration that normal people who are not flush with cash and industry connections can still make their artistic dreams a reality on their own little shoestring budgets.
Yes, with all human talent, fuck AI.
Fuck
Fuck all forms of generative
AI.
AI.
And if you're offended by
Yeah.
that, fuck you too. The last tip on the character section before we move on to the other fundamentals is another one of those really fun practical tips. Steal your friends and family, then differentiate them.
Hey, this is a Koppelman tip as well.
Yeah,
Brian Koppelman in his writing vines said something like you can base characters on your like friends and family, you can disguise them later.
and isn't it a funny thing how there are certain tips that you never hear from people who just extrapolate good writing advice from the things they watch, but that you will frequently and consistently hear from people who make a living in the creative world.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is that you're not going to get from watching anything the exact insights you could learn from your family member or like someone you know. You will holistically not create a more realistic character by taking something that is fictional and putting it into your work. And I think that the greats, as it were, recognize that because the reason that their work resonates with so many people is because it is about people, not about fake people.
Yeah, their characters ring with a real sense of realism. I think it's something that can be valuable as well when you are making collaborative pieces of art too. Like Addison and Zooey, who play the main characters, Faustina and Bellamy in Killjam, so many traits from both of them have been put into those characters. And the same is true in a lot of ways for Blythe, Takai, and Josh, who play Colette. Sorry, I haven't forgotten the characters' names. I was just thinking, what order of name did I say the actors in? And what order should I say the characters in? But Colette,
Right.
Eisen, and Telesphore. But yeah, I think it's something that when you pull from real life and when you pull from real life directly around you, which is to say, dear God, no one wants another villain based on Donald Trump or Elon Musk because we have enough of those cunts in real life all the fucking time.
Yeah, unless that's like your dad, like unless your name is like Baron Trump and you're trying to write
Yeah.
like focus on an actual relative of yours and like an actual, just real people you know. And hey, I think it also helps to like people and care about like, perceiving their interiority, their thoughts, their feelings, their beliefs, what they love. Hopefully some of what they love being you because you're a positive influence in their life. That typically helps you get to know people better, and that also helps you like portray them better when you put them in their work. Sometimes they may not always be flattered by the way they're depicted, but you don't have to tell them about the unflattering parts. You don't have to tell them that's them. If they are flattered, then yes, tell them it's them.
Yeah, misanthropes don't make very good writers. Hello again, Ayn Rand. Anyway, I'm going to read out his advice on this section. If you want to become a mangaka, then creating character histories is another skill you need to practice. Before making a sheet of your own characters, try making some based on yourself, your friends, acquaintances, and family, your heroes. Let's say you're doing one on yourself. This calls for some self-inspection that you're probably not used to doing. What kind of person am I? What do I like? What do I fear? And so on. But as you fill in each blank, a character should begin to form. During this process, you must make sure you list your weaknesses and not only your strengths. When you're creating a character on a personal hero, you may only be able to think of the positives, and it might be difficult to think about any flaws or petty foibles. But by thinking of both the traits to which you aspire to along with that person's weaknesses, you'll create a three-dimensional character. Those weaknesses lead to distress, which your character will make efforts to overcome. The most important part of making a character is to leave them room to grow. By depicting your character's efforts, you are depicting them growing as a person. This carries over into the story, but I'll cover that in the next chapter.
And as we've said before in other videos on this channel, I think, like, resist the part of you that says, like, oh, self-inserts are cringe. Because, really, that is putting up a barrier that will limit you. If you're not willing to put any of yourself into any of your characters, or even a lot of yourself into one of your characters, then you're going to get less out of the experience. And that character may come across as less fleshed out. Not saying you have to do it, but you shouldn't be preventing yourself or like, treat it as like this like ironclad rule that you cannot break.
Yeah, I think so. And this leads on to tip 8 in the world of plot. We're over halfway in now. And I think this is where, for a lot of people who are very entrenched in Western writing advice, things are about to get a little bit weird. The immutable rule of storytelling is the subheading. And he says, now that I've hopefully convinced you that story is indispensable to manga, let's move on to what constitutes good stories and how to create them. Any manga that can be considered famous, as well as any novels or movie, will share certain story beats that will never stop captivating audiences. The basic version of this structure can be summed up as Kisho Tenketsu, or introduction, key, development, show, twist, ten, and resolution, ketsu. Let's use a fighting manga as an example. Introduction. Introduce the protagonist to the reader. The important part here is to have the protagonist appear as quickly as possible. The reader mustn't think, when the hell is the main character going to show up? Development. The protagonist encounters the antagonist or some hardship, etc. Twist. The protagonist rises to face the challenge, but an additional problem creates a dilemma. In this part of the story, the protagonist attempts to strike back at the antagonist/hardship, but the difficulties keep building, and the readers will keep turning pages to find out what will become of the protagonist. Resolution. A victory or other happy end. For this example, I've greatly simplified Kisho Tenketsu's story structure, and this foundation of any shonen fighting manga where the protagonist faces and defeats their opponents. From this one base, introduction, development, twist, resolution, infinite variations can be born. It could be Kisho Tenketsu, where a hero is beset by obstacle after obstacle, or Ketsu Kisho Ten, where the ending is revealed first. You could lead with a scene showing the fallen hero, as if to give a preview of what is going to occur. That could then be enough to make the reader think, hey, this is something different, I wonder what will lead to this moment, and want to turn the next page. Creators who willfully eschew the entire Kisho Tenketsu pattern, for example by making a manga that solely depicts their characters' uneventful daily lives, can still produce masterworks, but only when done when purpose and knowledge of the pattern in the first place. Without exception, you must have Kisho Tenketsu in your mind when creating stories. This is the immutable rule of story writing.
I'll be honest, I am not that familiar with Kisho Tenketsu myself. I've never really written any stories with it, simply because I come from a different cultural background. I was never taught Kisho Tenketsu, so it seems like it takes a similar role as the Joseph Campbell monomyth hero's journey does in American and a lot of Western type media. The monomyth has been adapted and changed so many times that it itself has its own forms of when Araki was moving the syllables around and repeating certain syllables. There is always going to be a basis in whatever culture you come from. To me, I think what the real immutable rule is you should not ignore that your audience has indeed heard a story before, and that you
I
have.
think in many ways, probably the closest Western equivalent to Kisho Tenketsu is the classic 3 or 5 act structure, and in a similar way to Araki is doing here, most writing advice places, especially more like dogmatic ones like screenwriting advice, though admittedly again, more from people who are professional screenwriting advice givers than professional screenwriters, that they will tell you
It's
that like the
true.
3 act structure and the kind of baggage that goes along with it is something that is immutable, when clearly, in much the same way that Gus was saying, like, I only became familiar with Kisho Tenketsu in maybe the last 5 years, and Gus maybe in the last like year or like several months. So at the end of the day, I think the real takeaway here is the importance of like being aware of there are different styles that you can take up to look at the structure of your work, and these are all useful tools that have their place. But B, also to acknowledge how culturally relativistic the idea of story structure is. This is a really strange example, but it was actually something that I was reading in a book called The Creative Act, The Way of Being, by the famous music producer Rick Rubin. And he had a really interesting chapter about chess computers in it. You know, the kind of like AI models, not generative AI, don't worry, that are like built to like play games like chess and Go.
Yes, yeah. I'm
And
familiar
he
with
was
those.
talking about the first incident where a computer program beat the Grandmaster of Go, which was previously thought to be a game that is so complicated that fundamentally a thing that thinks in a binary way, like a computer, could never beat a human player at it. Until at a point someone did develop a machine, it beat the like reigning Go Grandmaster, and that guy retired shortly after. And while I think it would be easy to kind of take the sort of like bloody computers mentality from that, Rick Rubin was actually able to extrapolate something really positive from it, because he said that the decisive moment in the fight, or the match or the game, I suppose. I see. This is what happens when you're reading
Right.
Araki, like in the fight.
Yeah, right, yeah. Go, famously a game of like battling like mecha boxing matches in like
Exactly.
in a fight. Yeah.
But here's
Yeah.
the thing.
Oh my
It
god.
beat the Grandmaster with one decisive move, a move that was so bizarre that when it made it, the Grandmaster got up and had to leave the room for a minute before coming back, continuing the game and losing. There were what was considered basically 2 options for the like 37th move in the game. The 2 possible strategies. And the computer didn't pick either of them. It picked a random third option that the commentator at the time said that is a move that no experienced player of the game would ever pick. And it rattled the guy enough that he couldn't predict what it was going to do next, and he lost. What Rick Rubin extrapolated from that is The difference is that all of these Go grandmasters, who are no doubt incredible strategists, were brought up in the cultures and traditions of how Go is played. They would be told, oh, here's what you do, this is what the great grandmasters of the past have done, this, that, and the other. Whereas all that a computer, which doesn't have that human element, comes from is, well, okay, what are the literal hard and fast rules of the game Go, with no preconceived notions? And as a result, it simply did not place any false cultural or traditional limitations on itself on what moves it was supposed to make, and was only thinking in the purest, widest sense, well, what moves physically can I make? And the lesson for creativity is learning that sometimes you need to think, what are the rules that I'm following because they are the hard and fast rules? Which is, if you're writing a novel, you shouldn't finger paint your manuscript on the walls of your bedroom in shit like a crazy person. Between what is dogma, what is people, telling me, oh, you should do this because these guys have done this, and not considering the exceptions. And that is what I think I take from the 3X structure, Kisho Tenketsu. It's that in reality, when multiple people say you absolutely need to do this, it means you don't absolutely need to do any of them, and you can forge your own path.
Yeah, especially because, like, when sometimes people will create their own new immutable rules, hopefully remember that it did come from their observations and is, in its own way, the third Go move. Like, a good example would be Dan Harmon and his story circle. That is loosely based on the monomyth, but it is very much its own thing, adhering to its own structure, in my opinion at least, is at least an improvement because it allows other people working within it to create more third Go moves of their own while still having a foundation to fall back on if they ever feel too lost and forget which game they're playing.
Exactly. Have those foundations, but always consider the third Go move. Sometimes the path that's less trodden has some interesting shit down there.
I really like the idea of the third Go move. If you've made it this far into the video, type the third Go move into your comment and describe what your third Go move is.
Yeah, because I think there is something really cool about it. This idea of like sometimes the outsider, the kind of naive artist, can beat the grandmaster just because they haven't applied so many arbitrary restrictions to themselves.
Yes, and for the one commenter who I forget what video it was on that said we might have been saying outsider art in a snobbish way or referring to snobbish connotations when we call things outsider art, we're not. In fact, we like the idea that people that are not in the established academia of creation or the, privileged people who are given a certain artistic education or are reified through certain structures get to make art. We think that everybody who wants to should be able to. And there's nothing snobbish about acknowledging that people can come from anywhere and do art, even though there are establishment blockades that sometimes they'll have to overcome or defy.
Yeah,
Nothing snobbish about
no,
that.
not in the slightest. If anything, I think it's the complete opposite of the attitude of elitism. Some of the most interesting artists in the world are drawing paintings on the side of the road and like busking for pennies on the dollar.
Or even scrawling their novel on the wall in their own shit, Henry Galley.
No,
you
you're
snob.
right. You're right. Like if your third Go move is writing the most epic poop wall novel that the world has ever seen, who the fuck am I to stop you?
Because here's the thing, even if the writing itself is mostly mid, you can still make a killing selling clothespins to anyone who wants to try it.
It's true. I mean, the thing is, we are the guys who famously said that someone needs to write The Great Gatsby of Vor. I think
Yes.
we still believe that. If you think that's you, get in touch. We'd love to chat. Okay, so speaking of like writing rules and things that are a little bit more dogmatic, this brings us to tip 9, which I think is a really interesting one because I think it's another one that is going to be contentious to some degree, but one that Araki himself offers really interesting caveats from that draws specifically on creative decisions he made in Stardust Crusaders. So big fans of that arc, come get your juice.
Yes. Oh, here we fucking go.
The rule of rising and falling. He says, once you've learned the foundation of story structure, you next must be careful of the rule of rising and falling. I want you to visualize a horizontal baseline against which you will measure the rise or fall of your protagonist's emotional state or circumstances. Earlier, I touched upon the importance of always having your characters grow, but especially in shonen manga, your protagonist must always be rising, rising, and rising still, building and building, or you won't have a hit. To put it in the context of a sports manga, the protagonist might start at a district level tournament, then state, then national, as he rises to meet the challenge of stronger and stronger opponents. This is a perfect example of an always rising plot. The common approach to battles in fighting manga is to always be raising the stakes, and creating a question of how far it will go. If the hero does this, the enemy does that. If the hero attacks like this, the enemy counters like that. This constant build-up may feel like an inflationary bubble that is bound to burst, but if you read any successful manga, you should find that on a basic level, the protagonist is always rising. The ideal pattern is for your protagonist to progressively overcome tougher challenges as the pages turn, and as for those challenges to make the reader believe the hero might lose, but the hero will always win in the end. A story's success will pivot on finding good ideas to keep this positive motion building.
Yeah, and I can see a lot of places that this applies to JoJo's in particular, without even getting into the different stand battles. The vehicles they use to get from Japan to Egypt vary from like airplanes to boats to cars to camels to submarines. They are always like going somewhere new, some way new. And even though they'll get waylaid at every new turn by some like stand user, there is this forward momentum that like no matter what hardships will be faced in the moment, the forward momentum is still occurring. There will even be failures that can lead the character forward even as they crush them emotionally.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that is a staple of Araki's writing. And he gives an example of because it's one of his beliefs that the hero always has to be rising. And he said that he felt like the period of time that JoJo's was on the shakiest ground was those first few chapters when Dio is like really ruining Jonathan's life. And he said, while it doesn't seem like as big a problem now, early on these were coming out week to week and he said that like at the time the comic was getting absolutely slaughtered in the reader popularity polls because people were being like, why does this guy like get his ass kicked all the time, why can't he do something about it? And he said that's something that he's like really tried to avoid since.
I can understand that. There is a lot of stuff with Jonathan early on where like he will just spend like so many moments just like sitting on like a hill and being like, ah, Dio, or like kicking a tree and just be like, God, Dio, he's ruining my life. And Dio really like goes into him. Like if Dio was not charismatic, as we previously said, and didn't have like his own interesting motivations, I think like a lot of people would feel a lot more like, why are we even reading this? This is just like sadism with no purpose. Because like some really bad shit happens to Jonathan early on throughout this. I think that like there are other moments throughout JoJo's run where like things that are just as devastating and bad occur with the character, but the way it is handled is so different. For example, in JoJo's Part 2, the death of Caesar Zappelli, and the way that that compels Joseph Joestar to move forward. On one hand, it's like without Caesar, this is like, the darkest moment that this character has ever been to. This is his best friend. How will he ever recover? On the other hand, he ties Caesar's headband to his head, and he goes into that grudge match with Wamu, Caesar's killer, who is, yes, named after the band Wham. Because that's how JoJo's is. That's how it rolls. But if you look at this from two different perspectives, you see losing Caesar might look on the surface like it is the hero is not rising. The hero has like fallen so far. But in truth, it is another example of the hero rising. I think that Araki is being true to his technique here.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about this is in the next section, I'm not going to read this whole bit out because I think people are going to be eager to hear him actually talk about how he kind of put his money where his mouth is in Stardust Crusaders. But he has this interesting thing where he talks about, in his opinion, that the kind of tournament structure as a storytelling device has serious limitations because he compares it to an economic bubble of the fact that like growth and strength increase and sort of power creep, to use our modern parlance, is simply something that is not sustainable beyond a point, in the same way that, like a pyramid scheme could only go through like 13 rotations of get five of your friends involved before like all of humanity is part of that pyramid. And I think it is a very
Yeah,
valid
no, I
criticism.
to go for like a sort of different shonen comparison, there is a certain way people talk about the Dark Tournament arc in Yu Yu Hakusho, and there is a certain way people don't talk about the next Demon Tournament.
Yeah, but thankfully, Araki, G that he is, has a solution, which brings us to a section called Why Readers Appreciated Stardust Crusaders, in which he says, and this is his kind of point of, well, here is how you solve the tournament arc power creep problem while reconciling it with the hero must always rise. So he says this. During the height of the popularity of tournament manga, I was able to approach them as a reader and enjoy the excitement, but I couldn't help but wonder from a creator's point of view what the mangaka would do after the top of the tournaments. At the time, Jojo was struggling in the reader surveys, and people even suggested that I add a tournament format to help me gain popularity. But thematically, Jojo is in part about passing the torch across generations. If Jonathan climbs to the top of some kind of tournament, what will the next generation do? To have any kind of decline goes against the royal road of shonen manga. Oh, that's not something I've brought up, by the way, but he calls his method the royal road, which I have to say I think is really badass. Oh, that's sick.
That rules. I feel like I've heard that term before. Like maybe it has like a deeper
No,
cultural
it does. The
knowledge
royal
that I don't
road.
know about, but
The Royal Road, I think, was a really famous trading route for a period of time. But it's like euphemistically become sort of like the best way.
okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
Cool,
an-
cool. I like
anyway,
that.
back in off the Royal Road. So he says, I put some thought into how I could maintain that rising action without utilizing a tournament structure. What I came up with was a journey, like the long running television series Mitokomon, or like a board game, where each step forward is met with an enemy to fight. I used this structure for Part 3, Stardust Crusaders. At each step, an enemy is battled, but each enemy doesn't have to be stronger than the last. This avoids the tournament structure's inflationary increase in power from each fight to the next. Now, if the fighters aren't always increasing in might, then where is the positive forward motion? The protagonist and his allies are approaching a destination, and they're always moving forward. In Stardust Crusaders, the protagonist Jotaro and his allies fight many opponents as they head to their final adversary, now known as Dio. Because they never turn back, the story is never moving in a negative direction. I believe that Stardust Crusaders was able to elude the stagnation common to manga series because I was able to follow the rule of always rising in a way that didn't copy other mangaka. And I will say as well, I think that exact thing can be said of why One Piece is so enduring. Like, obviously the like villains in that
Hmm.
show do get like insanely powerful, but at the same time, it's more that they're always going to interesting new locations and they're always getting closer to the One Piece.
Yeah, and I would say so. And I think like what a lot of the One Piece Devil Fruit powers, not hockey, we're not going to get into it, but not hockey. A lot of the Devil Fruit powers and a lot of the stand powers from JoJo's have in common is that they change the dimension of a fight in such a way that it does not come down to the raw stats. The one weird trick that doctors hate that each character can do makes the fight against them a unique event, one that requires specific rules, almost like a particular sport that is being made up for that particular fight. Stardust Crusaders so masters this that, like, stands kind of became the de facto way that battles were decided in every JoJo part further onward, because one can be a flesh bud in someone's arm that is slowly growing to control them. Another can be a threat inside of a submarine that can control inanimate objects and, like, have them attack people. Another can be a giant false sun in the desert that beats down on people. One can be an orangutan with a sentient warship under his complete control. Yes, all of these are real. All of them are in Stardust Crusaders. It's amazing. It's great. And none of the fights feel like they are lesser for the fights that happen before or after them, because they are all unique spectacles.
Yeah, stand battles are kind of always about picking that third go move.
It's true, because the thing is, like, and this comes to, like, fans making their stands. What is really strongly discouraged when people make their own stands is that nobody should come out with, like, my stand is a big laser beam that, like, shoots out in, like, hundreds of feet, and anything that it touches is destroyed immediately, and I win, and I get $1 million for each person that dies as a result of it. That is not what, like, a good stand is. Most of the best stands in JoJo's are the ones that, like, on the surface are like, well, that's so weak, that's so stupid, why would that even be able to do anything? And then you see it in a fight in the way that it's applied, and you're like, that's the scariest thing ever this week.
I mean, for a start, you actually can have way more interesting debates over, like, who would win, this villain or this villain, rather than, like, well, obviously this villain would beat this villain because they came later on, so they have a higher power level. But it also means that, well, ironically, it actually makes comparing the villains more fun. You don't have to compare the villains.
Exactly, exactly. The episodes based around, like, these enemy stand users really allow the stand users to be the stars of that show.
Yeah.
Because, like, the Stardust Crusaders have their individual superpowers, but really, the way that a lot of those fights play out is that they are sort of being faced with a, like, supernatural happening that they have to deal with. It's, a little bit like a, like, kind of police procedural in, like, the weird criminal of the week, or like a weird mystery of the week as well, where it's like something is occurring and it's going to, like, continue to occur and continue to, like, get weird until you find the way to stop it. And then next week there's going to be, like, a different monster of the week.
I'm also going to throw in my own little bit of personal advice on this. I think as well, it's another thing where thinking of your villains in terms of what they will be like and how they will present a threat specifically to your protagonist is way more fun than just thinking, how do I make the most powerful and threatening villain possible? In Killjown Triple X, because of its very, like, anime-inspired premise, all of the kind of major enemies in it are jammers, who are other players in the, like, crazy all-female death games. And we try to, when writing the show, keep the villains varied in the specific threats that they will present towards the protagonist, Faustina. One of the jammers that she fights early on is Mother Hysteria, who is this kind of terrifying cyborg nun with a giant kind of shape-changing machine gun, who is voiced inexplicably by Chelsea from the Dead Meat channel, who Faustina manages to, like, fight and go toe-to-toe with. But there's a villain later on called Lucifuga the Undying, who is a giant cockroach woman who would undoubtedly be immediately killed by Mother Hysteria, but is a huge threat to Faustina because she's afraid of bugs.
Well, the other thing too is that like Faustina's abilities and the way she fights are like pretty simple and understandable to the audience. She is a brawler in universe. That's a term for someone who doesn't use gene mods or cyberization and just uses martial arts. But this leaves room for like the enemy jammers to always have bizarre weaponry or strange gimmicks. It's a little bit like pro wrestling. Like for
Oh, it's
example, it's
it's a
like
lot of
what's
it like
John
pro
Cena's
wrestling.
gimmick? Well, I know, but I'm making an example, Henry Galley, and sometimes a turn of phrase a little bit like is a lead into something. I wasn't debating the accuracy here. I was gonna say something about how John Cena's like, like he's basically a strong guy who wins, and he's got a theme music. But a lot of the other like, heel wrestlers, like, Undertaker, for example, they get to be a little stranger. They get to be a little bit more bizarre in like what they bring to the table. And like someone who is more seen as an opponent or an adversary, that is a little bit more appropriate. And you see that in Stardust Crusaders, where Jotaro's Star Platinum is capable of dishing out a lot of like punches and hard blows, and occasionally doing like weirder stuff that is situational to each fight. But on the whole, it is a very simple power set. The enemies, they're the complicated ones. They're the situational ones. They're the ones that like, oh man, like because we're fighting this guy at sea, he's like 10 times more dangerous than if we were fighting him on land. Not like this character would just be like on a flat plane, winning any kind of stat contest.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point, dude, in how, like, villains get to have a real, like, specificity because your protagonists, because they have to face such a variety of different situations, especially if you're following this Araki roadmap of like different villains, different locations, always progressing. So they need to have a kind of versatility because if your hero's thing is like too specific, unless you're making a specific joke about it, like say One Punch Man, ultimately it's going to get really dull. So they need to be a little bit more of an all-rounder, whereas like a villain can roll up and be like, "Yeah, this is my thing." Like again, I think in season 1 of Killjoy we have Heavy Nettle, who is like a blind plant woman with vines. We have Levita the She-Wolf, who is a furry that rips people apart. Drill Bitch, who is like a mecha that has a drill for an arm. Not a jam up, there's an old lady with a gun who was inspired by the mugger from the Super Mario Brothers movie because we love trash here at We Are Not Alive. Like,
Yes, we do.
you can
Yes, we
have
do.
real fun with it and always move sideways, but there are some things that, according to Araki Sensei, you cannot do. Would you like to hear those things?
Yes, I would.
This is tip 10, the 4 story taboos.
Oh my goodness. Oh, don't break these or the stand will get you.
Like, these are genuinely...
That is the rules of this stand encounter.
These are genuinely, in his opinion, these are the 4 things that you should literally never, under any circumstances, do, and we cannot wait to read all the comments telling us about the exceptions.
Oh, I'm so excited. Oh, bring it
So
on.
I'm going to do it one by one. Story taboo number 1. The author speaks. This is right at the top of the list of what techniques not to use. When the author inserts himself outside of the panel, it's usually meant as a kind of fan service, and superfans might indeed be happy for it. But the story is what's most important, and interrupting it in this way creates a sudden rupture in the narrative. Also, any successful efforts to draw your readers into the world of your story will go to waste as you suddenly pull them out of it. To do this is to disrespect your readers who want to become immersed in your manga. Admittedly, this one I feel like is also a flaw that is very specific to manga, where the kind of like little like author avatar might show up and like soapbox for a bit.
Yeah, and I'm also just thinking of like, to go back to Yu Yu Hakusho, while on the whole, that manga is good for a good long while, there are these bizarre panels that just exist as these sort of like extra weird illustrations that just have Tagashi just kind of fucking around. Like, and don't get me wrong, some of them are really charming. Like, he drew this little like squirrel thing once that was just like in the middle of a panel just going meep, and I don't know what that was about, but it was part of the manga. Sometimes sometimes it does just get grating or distracting at the very least.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I enjoy in like a separate stance a kind of peek behind the curtain. I think if we didn't, we wouldn't be so interested in this book, you know, because we were like, no, we will never observe how the sausage is made, ever. Let us stay in mystical ignorance. But I think it is also true that, you know,
Right.
in a
No.
post-death of the author world, there are sometimes these kind of like revenant authors who are like, let me assert my opinion directly from me into the story where you can't avoid it.
You know, I get these like flashbacks to the spiral into madness that was the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and
Oh
just how
God,
like
yeah.
more and more of more was sort of showcased throughout the entire like ending of that, to the point that it kind of stops being fiction even as it tries to be all fiction, which is also the name of Kumagawa's stand. Shit, I mean his minus. Shit, I mean, can we get out of this sentence, please?
Story Taboo 2 is Coincidences, where he says, say your protagonist is in a pinch, and then a meteorite suddenly falls, or a police officer happens to walk by, or an old ally shows up to save the day, or a god or gods appears, or a divine storm comes rushing in, or some other happenstance. It's not going to make for a particularly convincing resolution, is it? Now, if you've put in the work of foreshadowing it, that's one thing, but forcing something into the story that has no relation to the plot, the characters, or the setting is always a bad idea.
Yeah, I think this is the Deus Ex
Yeah,
Machina.
it
Like this
is.
is what people, especially like the poorly executed Deus Ex Machina. Like there are examples of authors who like employ a version of Deus Ex Machina, of like a sudden surge of an unexpected happenstance that swings the momentum in a different direction. Like for example, Tolkien's Eucatastrophe, which symbolizes kind of the mechanisms of the universe shifting towards something sudden and good and unexpected from the logic of what came before. I think that has like deeper connotations both within Tolkien's work, within his like personal philosophy of writing, and I do think it is something distinctly different from Deus Ex Machina despite the similarities. And also, I would say that there are some authors who probably like don't share Araki's view on this at all. I think by and large though, I kind of do.
No, I think he's right. Like, I am a big believer in that old truism. Coincidences that get your character into more trouble are great. Coincidences that get your character out of trouble suck. For it to be a true Deus Ex Machina, it has to be something that was like complete bullshit. I'm going to take Lord of the Rings as an example here. The reinforcements and the Rohirrim turning up at the end of Helm's Deep isn't a Deus Ex Machina because Gandalf went off to do that earlier in the story. Ditto for Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli going to recruit the army of the dead to come join in at Minas Tirith. If the army of the dead had just randomly shown up and no one knew who they were and they killed, like, the orc army, that would be bullshit. There's something that I absolutely love in Resident Evil 4, both the original and the remake, where there is a part where you are walking through a forest, and if you listen closely, you can hear like a wolf yowling in pain. If you go off the beaten track, you will find this wolf with its leg caught in a bear trap, and you have the option to free the wolf. And if you free the wolf, it just runs off. And then later, when you're in a boss fight with this like giant mutant ogre called El Gigante, if you found and saved the wolf earlier, a cutscene will suddenly happen in the middle of the fight where the wolf turns up and leaps in and helps distract it so you can get the jump on it. And I think that's a perfect example of that is foreshadowed. That is cause and effect. You did a thing, like a like benevolent act, and it helps you. Whereas it would be complete bullshit if you were fighting this boss, and then randomly a wolf that you've never seen before shows up and helps you.
It's true. It's true. And I love that example with the wolf and the El Gigantes. That is like great storytelling through game mechanics. I think what's interesting about this tip, or at least this like taboo, is how it intersects with comedy. Because I think that there are certain stories where the repeated use of this technique puts it back on the table in a way that is acceptable. For example, the shonen manga parody comedy series known as Bobobo Bobo
A
Bobo by
classic.
Yoshio Sawai, it employs this in a way that, like, while, like, the characters are employing a fighting style known as Wigan or Hajike that allows them to basically do anything as long as a nerves creeps out and throws the opponent off their game, and all of them have, like, super fist martial arts that, like, they could derive specific techniques from. The techniques they use to win specific fights are generated, like, for the encounter stands of their own employed by the heroes. For example, if Bobobo, like, needs to defeat a guy who is all about how powerful money is, he may employ a technique that reminds the villain of the power that is in everyday middle-class life in order to shatter his expectations and faith in that money can grant him the power he needs in the world. Every fight will inevitably lead to Bobobo creating some new technique that is both the least expected, but also potentially the funniest thing he could possibly do in that circumstance. But I think the reason Bobobo is able to get away with that is because it is making, like, sport out of doing the thing that would be wrong to do in a straightforward thing because it's a parody.
Yeah, that's the thing. Comedy often works on a completely different set of rules because one of the key elements of comedy is surprise, is playing with your expectations. I think a similar thing is a Tamil movie that Meg watched called Kadasila Biryani, which is a kind of like Tarantino-esque black comedy. In the like last act, in a confrontation with the villain that seems like completely unwinnable, the villain is just completely run over by a truck driver by accident, and the guy's like, "Oh god, that's the 36th time I've hit someone." And it's like, again, it's funny
That
because it's just what an insane way to solve your movie's main conflict.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I'm also thinking of, like, another thing from, like, a comedy that you and I are obviously familiar with because on this channel we sometimes talk about SpongeBob, but in that first SpongeBob movie with the, like, how are they gonna get back to Bikini Bottom? I can take you there. David Hasselhoff.
Yeah, that's something that, like, the surprise and the weirdness of that is so funny. Though again, even then in SpongeBob, it's used to set up further set pieces and conflicts when Dennis shows up and they fight on David Hasselhoff's back.
Okay, two things about the David Hasselhoff backfight. Number one, that feels like the most Stardust Crusaders thing that happened in the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. And number two, I remember playing the SpongeBob SquarePants movie video game, and it really hits different to have, like, a, like, 3D model of David Hasselhoff rather than the live action version as the arena for that boss fight. It just doesn't feel right. It's not the same.
Well, the funny thing is, for those scenes on David Hasselhoff's back, and you can look up pictures, they are super creepy. They built a giant David Hasselhoff.
I think I saw that in the behind the scenes.
Yeah, like that's just a huge prop because obviously it would look really unconvincing if it was just a photo of David Hasselhoff they were animating on, but they also couldn't be like, David, stay still for like this length of time while we animate little cartoon sea creatures like battling on your ass.
I wonder what that giant David Hasselhoff is,
Yeah, where
where it
is
is right
that?
now.
I hope David Hasselhoff has it. I hope it's in his home.
I hope when he wants to play a prank at someone, he leaves the room and then re-enters carrying that thing face first. So they're like, "Ah, David, you've grown to monster size. You've become a titan from Shingeki no Kyojin."
It would be either that or some like wealthy and eccentric like German Deutsche Bank exec has like bought it for his own home because Baywatch is fucking huge in Germany for some reason. Are you ready for the third taboo?
Yes, yes.
The protagonist blunders. No matter how much trouble you're having coming up with an idea to put the protagonist into a conflict, you mustn't make the protagonist blunder into a problem of their own creation. That in itself is a negative-oriented story. Let's say your protagonist is a policeman, and he goes out to investigate but forgets his badge and gun and gets into a dangerous situation because of that unnatural premise. The very second a reader thinks, a cop isn't ever going to do that, you've probably lost the reader. Japanese movies often use such moments, shouting, "Are you alright?" while wildly shaking a dying person, a cell phone suddenly losing signal, going to shoot a gun only to find it's out of ammo. Outside of a gag or parody, these all exemplify a pattern that is cheap and feels cheap and are best avoided. Again, that is something where I'm glad he made the allowance for the gag or parody.
Things like that can subjectively feel frustrating in the moment, but I think from a craft standpoint, I don't know if it's something that we need to limit, and I also don't know if it, like, really differentiates itself enough from the previous taboo.
Yeah, and I think again, I mentioned Uncut Gems earlier as one of my favorite movies. It would be like watching that and being like, I can't watch this. Why doesn't he just stop making bets?
Why don't they stop talking over each other and just have a conversation where they take turns exchanging dialogue?
It's like, well, why can't they just make a deal where he will frequently make small payments in installments to make Arno whole again, and then they don't need to hire these goons to chase him anymore? It's really silly that Howard, when he keeps getting these little windfalls, tries to parlay them up into more winnings and doesn't just give them back to the like violent loan sharks after him.
Why can Howard Ratner not just be faithful to his wife and or end the relationship amicably so he can be with his new love interest?
Yeah, again, I think it is this problem of sometimes tips like this, like you said, while in situations where they are truly egregious, they can be quite annoying. A lot of the time, being a little bit too militant about this kind of stuff is how you get those, like, Abed sensible horror movie type moments.
In this one in particular, it's hard to enforce this one unless you're like really, as you said, militant about it.
Yeah, and I'm personally of the belief that maybe it is that I have like a bit of a predilection towards tragic structures, even when not in an overall tragedy. But personally, I like when a character's fundamental flaw that they need to overcome leads to them making mistakes that like exacerbate their troubles, because I think sometimes it can be this problem, and this is something that is the case with shonen protagonists sometimes. I think partly owing to the fact that they're written for younger audiences on the whole, but so many of their problems are like purely external. And if they have character flaws, they're really more like quirks than actual flaws.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing sometimes too is that shonen characters have this like unfortunate tendency to take actions which are seen as correct because they're doing them. Like a good example would be in the like Kage Summit arc of Naruto, which happens like much later into the series. You get this weird moment of like Naruto begging the Raikage to not go after Sasuke, who at this point has killed the Raikage's brother to his knowledge, and also plans to attack the Kage Summit and potentially kill more of the 5 Kages. So you're left with this moment of like, yeah, Naruto, it's well and good that you forgive Sasuke, but it's weird for us to be like, well, when this guy who said he's going to kill you show up and has already killed your brother, forgive him, be nice to him, don't hurt him.
And times
It's
like that
like
are parodied.
protagonist-focused morality.
Times like that are parodied so brilliantly in things that we often talk about, like that one scene from The Nice Guys that's like, come on, this isn't you. She literally just said she murdered 2 people. No, I mean, like, on the inside. Like,
Well, it's because so much protagonist-focused morality is like that. Weirdly enough, this relates to a manga anime quote that I really enjoy from the series Baki, which is its own strange can of worms. At one point, a old kung fu master character starts like behaving erratically during a fight against like a much stronger opponent, and his disciple is like, well, the master is doing it, so it must be kung fu. And I think about that a lot. I think that applies to like a lot of things where it's like, surely that's what's happening here. It can't just simply be that he's lost it.
it's like my other favorite anime protagonist, Richard Nixon, who said, when the president does it, it's not illegal.
Exactly. Same with Stardust the Super Wizard. His superpower is anything he does becomes legal as he does it.
This is my stand, Tricky Dick.
Oh no! All right, what's the fourth
So
taboo?
special move, the Southern strategy is The fourth taboo is
He's gonna say it.
it was all a dream. This is my absolute least favourite literary device. The protagonist was the criminal all along is in a similar vein. These resolutions not only betray the reader, who has become deeply invested in the story, and has been living it alongside the protagonist. Was it all a dream is the question with only one response. Give me back the part of my life I wasted on reading this.
Damn. Okay, that's really harsh, and I think that's a really common sentiment, but I also think that there are edge cases that justify this being used. Like, for example, a lot of the adaptations of Alice in Wonderland
Wizard
and
of
The
Oz,
Wizard of
too.
Oz. I think I beat you to that,
God damn
but
it.
also
Editing
sorry.
will
But
decide who
also,
got that first. Anyway, sorry, go on.
but also, you know, what I think is a sort of like modern Portal story classic that is Over the Garden Wall, which ends in this really bizarre space of the question of was it all a dream is given legitimate ambiguity, which sort of adds to the otherworldly atmosphere of that entire short miniseries. I think that this is one of those things that Araki doesn't particularly like, and is definitely a taboo for him, and also it doesn't seem like he enjoys stories with it as an audience member. I can't personally say it's a taboo for me.
I think for me it's nuanced because I think I'm completely with him on matters of yes, it was definitively a dream. Everything that just happened, like in no way and in no tangible real reality did happen. I can enjoy those times when it's a little bit more strange and ambiguous, especially when it goes to enhance the themes of the work, as is the case for Over the Garden Wall and some of those other examples. So, yeah, I think, like with a lot of things, it's all relative. The third go move always applies.
Yeah, I agree. So those were the 4 taboos. What's next?
Its tip 11 is keep your dialogue sounding natural.
Huh. Okay, this is from the guy who wrote JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, right?
Yeah, so are you ready to hear what he has to say about this?
Please, go on. I need
I
context.
think there are going to be some
context.
there
Context.
there are
Sure.
going to be some actual parts of this where you might genuinely scream bullshit when he says some of this. Like, not even based on your opinions, but just based on things he does in his work. Here we go. When writing dialogue, the basic aim is to keep it all feeling natural. As your characters go about their actions, don't overthink the dialogue. Just write what they would naturally say in each situation. Later, you can go back over lines and make sure they are understandable. Say a pretty girl suddenly appears before our protagonist. Does he get nervous? Does he flirt? Does he tease her? Does he approach her respectfully and with good manners? From slight differences in his mannerisms and between the lines of his speech, the character's nature will be revealed. Also, dialogue in manga is never made more cool by using obscure or foreign words. In my opinion, it's best not to overthink the dialogue or add in dressed up words in an attempt to elevate the script. I'm going to do the second half in a sec. How do you feel about the first half?
I think like my mouth just kind of like fell more agape the longer you spoke, especially like everything past like the pretty girl example, because I'm just like I am just like
It's like
no, this is
Hirohiko Araki would never use
flabbergasting.
fancy foreign words in his manga.
Yeah, he would never call something Hierophant Green or the world.
Like
What are we
or
doing?
just all of the
Like,
Italian
okay.
stuff. It continues from there. He goes, ultimately, the best approach to communicating your story is to write characters with a way of thinking that's relevant to your own life, and to write dialogue that is easily understood and similar to daily speech. This will allow your story to reveal itself and help you express the world of your creation. If I suddenly walked into a desk, I'd probably say something like fucking hell, or what the hell is a desk doing there? Those are the kind of lines that would come natural to me if I were in that situation. I wouldn't say, I hope that didn't hurt the desk, or wow, that was something else. I'm often told that the dialogue in my manga is distinctive, but I'm only writing lines based on the way I actually think and talk in my daily life. Characters vastly different from yourself are an exception to this rule and will likely require research. Your characters are an important part of establishing the setting. Their professions may have jargon, as with sushi chefs, or there may be certain words someone like your character would never say. In the case of historical fiction, you may or may not want to reproduce the language of the time. If you throw in a few words from that period, you can better convey the sense of being in that time.
Okay, I definitely think that there is like some practical advice to be gleaned from that, especially about like research and time period and like, being true to the way you speak. But I also just feel, and this is not unique to Araki, the brass balls on some mangaka to be like, yeah, this is what they would say. Like when like with whatever character they're writing. We've spoken about this off mic before of like how like an entire world that inside of a manga is beholden to like whatever the author decides the characters would say at any given time, which is what leads to situations where grown men are writing like teenage girls like, wow, these big boobies I have sure are big. And it's like, what are we doing? Like, that's not natural dialogue, but it is like naturally what the author thinks about the character, so it's what they say. I don't know. I
I
can't
guess this has
square
got to
this
be
one
one of
because I think
those
it's
do as I say, not as I do type situation.
yeah, because I think Araki is giving good advice, but I also think that JoJo is all the more memorable for the fact that it doesn't follow this a lot of the time, or that Araki's version of this authentically is so different from my sensibilities that I find the dialogue in JoJo's to be weird and strange and silly. The unnatural quality, the distinctive quality, as Araki admits that people are willing to point out, to JoJo's dialogue is what makes it so unique. That being said, he does say some interesting things about how to achieve naturalistic dialogue, but I don't know. I don't think it's all that it's cracked up to be in terms of like that you need naturalistic dialogue, especially when like, the alternative, memorable dialogue sometimes creates an even bigger sensation or a stronger resonance with the readers or makes it more quotable.
And that's the thing. Like, naturalistic dialogue can still have very like memorable quotable things. It's so fucking funny that I keep bringing this up, but it seems to keep being relevant because it is somehow
Are you
the
gonna
perfect antithesis of everything Araki stands for. But Uncut Gems has has very naturalistic dialogue, and people still quote the kind of like "this is how I win," and they're like, "Holy shit, I'm gonna come" type stuff that is
Yeah,
like
yeah.
very unheightened.
Likewise, like, as we've mentioned like in another video recently, the fish scene from The Irishman, which I think is a very like natural exchange between some guys that would be busting each other's balls over like very minute things in what is a movie I think full of very naturalistic dialogue as well. Yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating to me that that Araki of all people has this
And don't
opinion.
get me wrong, you can go like so naturalistic that what you're making can become like almost sort of hilariously like anti-wit. Like I think a perfect example is the I think you should leave skit. The trailer for the Detective Crashmore movie with that like Dirty Harry style detective who is played by Santa Claus, who rather than having cool quips is always just like, you fucking suck before shooting someone.
Right, yeah, no, it's true, it's true. I'm also thinking, like, and this is a movie I watched for the Patreon that, like, I don't want to go into any further detail about because we'll update you when that's going to be released, but there was a scene in a movie I was watching for the Patreon that had, like, a full-ass normal, like, restaurant order take place with the characters. Like, the wait staff takes the order, everyone, like, does their order, and like it's saying nothing about the characters. It's just like conveying that yeah, this is a regular restaurant scene that just happens to have our cast in it for a bit. And that stuff really stands out. You're just like, "Oh my god, I feel like I'm not even watching a movie. Can we get back to whatever this was supposed to be?"
Literally, literally. Okay, so we are on the final stretch now. We are on the last three tips. What an amazing ride that this
Yes.
has been. But by the way, and people who are still
I
here,
know.
thank you. You will be rewarded because there's some great stuff to come. But if you've enjoyed this and you're not subscribed, we talk about fun, creative stuff, weird new media things, writing advice, our creative ethos on this channel all the time in so many different forms with so many of our different like dear friends and creative collaborators. If you're looking for that like shot of creative inspiration while still getting to like have a laugh and stick something on in the background, we highly recommend that you subscribe because we'd love to have you here.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And if you are not here, and in fact, it is your grandson or maybe your grandson's son who has lingered around here, because, this has been a multi-generational journey, get ready for these next few
I look
tips.
at the runtime. Oh no, we've been recording for 50 years!
Jojo!
So, tip 12 is, and here we are out of the world of plot and into the penultimate pillar, which is setting. And the advice is, readers want to be immersed. Would you like to hear what he has to say?
Yes, I do.
A manga's setting plays a vital role in attracting readers. A setting is an alternate reality, and as such, it must be grounded in realism. If you create a world haphazardly, the readers won't achieve immersion and will likely lose interest in reading your manga. Even if the world is fanciful, the setting must exist as a whole and structured entity within the mangaka's mind, and it must have an inner logic. Only then will readers become absorbed in the events that unfold within that world. People read manga because they want to experience unfamiliar worlds, sometimes ones that can't exist in our reality, like a frozen world, to give an example. They want to follow the adventures and great drama within the imaginary world of a manga. Yukinobu Hoshino's science fiction manga are exemplars of grand, fantastical worlds created with detail and realism. Even his spaceships are grounded in scientific theory and drawn with authenticity, as if they truly are floating through the weightlessness of outer space. If the ships had been drawn according to whim, they would have felt contrived, and readers would not have been able to become immersed in the manga's world. At the same time, readers are also interested in worlds that reflect their familiar daily lives. They enjoy the fiction, similar to their own lives but not the same, that only manga can provide. Representatives of this type of manga include Saze-san and Kochikame. In Saze-san, her family's home is established in detail, including the layout of the rooms and the locations of their possessions. In Kochikame, the area around the branch office is depicted in such meticulous detail that it creates the illusion that Ryo-san actually exists there. Because the worlds are portrayed so convincingly, readers desire to become immersed in them.
Yeah, and I think that like a lot of what makes a setting resonate with readers or feel like real and lived in isn't so much the like big macro world building details. It's whatever the story itself and the events draw a magic circle around for the characters to interact with. Because all the lore in the world is immaterial if it's invisible to us. For instance, Attack on Titan has a lot of lore in its world that like gets fleshed out later in the manga, but early on, we don't know much else than there is a big wall, there are big monsters that eat people behind that wall, and there is a technology that can fight those monsters which allows people to use cables and thin blades to navigate 3D space. And that's really all you need because those are the tangible physical details of what we're seeing.
Yeah, and I think what he said towards the end about the importance of these like smaller details as well, because for me, you have built a bad world if you have thought up like 10,000 different weapons and magic systems and whatever, but I can't picture what characters in this world would eat for dinner.
Yeah, or like, what the like average exchange of currency is. A lot of like fantasy worlds based on D&D really have this problem where it's like, is it 2 gold for a drink down at the bar? Well, that's a little strange because 2 gold is worth 400 silver, which is worth 600 or 800 copper. And really, like, if a copper piece a day is being paid to people, how are they like affording their drinks at all? Like, it just starts to like this stuff starts to break down when you think in like video game terms rather than in like what would it be like to live there?
Yeah, I think currency is a really good point to bring up because it's such a little thing that can be such an immersion breaker. Like, it can be really fun to come up with fictional currency. Like, Meg was able to explore all of the, like, 1910s era kind of, like, Western to Central European currency of the time to modify for that. I created my own currency, Kurats, which one is worth a tenth of a dollar, which gives a perspective on the kind of hyperinflation that is in this, like, future cyberpunk world of Kill Gem Triple X. But I think for me, very few things will make me feel like, okay, the author just didn't really care about a world quicker than, like you said, gold as currency in fantasy world and credits as currency in sci-fi world.
And like, when a manga like takes the idea of currency and like runs with it, it can like lead to these incredibly grounding moments. Like the manga and anime series Magi has this early arc where a country known as Balbad, which was trying to remain independent from a massive empire that controls most of the world, is trading with that empire and is soon going to be given a chance to trade out their own currency, which is falling out of favor, their country is going poor, and replace it all with this new currency, which is a fiat paper currency that's value is controlled by the empire. But in order to afford this change, which would cost like many times the treasury, the kingdom of Balbad is going to sell a significant amount of its population into indentured servitude and slavery throughout the empire. And this leads to a huge like economic, like ethical upheaval that the heroes need to stop because A, this will basically put Balbad under the thumb of the empire, and B, the average citizen's life quality is going to go extremely far down for anyone who is not the nobles who are buying into this new currency system.
I think another piece of kind of currency-based storytelling in the greatest video game of all time, don't at me, Fallout New Vegas, is the fact that, like, when you enter the New Vegas world, there are, like, two external forces, the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion, that are trying to vie for control, and as a result, you get the standard currency of the, like, the post-apocalyptic currency of the game, which is bottle caps. There is also a lot of, like, Legion denariuses around, which are, like, their currency, and NCR paper money. So exchange rates and selling off and like how different like merchants are aligned to these different groups and thus what these different currencies are worth to them becomes like a part of world building that also tangibly affects gameplay, and it's genius.
No, I think that is great. And again, like, these are the gritty daily life qualities that need to be present in a world if it is to be taken realistically. World building for a setting that, like, other people are going to try out is one thing. But if you're telling a story in it, the characters who are living in it, they're not, like, showing up for a little day trip or a vacation. They've lived their whole lives there because there's no other world to them. Make it feel like that, both on a character level and on a world level.
Yeah, create lived in worlds. And a great way to do that is actually tip 13. This is another tip that is so just quintessentially Araki. And this is in particular in regards to settings. Some things can't be researched online. He says, as you can see, countless considerations go into creating a setting. You may be able to get much of what you need by researching online, but sometimes you have to go do the research in person. Because of the time and effort involved in going in person is far more difficult than referring to research materials as you draw. But when you go to a location in person, you will find a real understanding of what you need for your drawing, and you might find the inspiration for new ideas. Quite often, you will also find that a location is different in person than you imagined it would be. Two areas may seem close to each other, but when you walk the distance, it is much farther in reality. A building that seemed enormous in a photograph may actually be underwhelming, or a location that seemed extravagant might surprise you with its tawdriness. Therefore, if you want to draw things, I recommend experiencing them for yourself as much as possible. After I started making Jojo, I got into the habit of visiting the things I was drawing whenever I could. Even for the third arc, Stardust Crusaders, I went to every location along the story's route, excluding more dangerous areas, up to and including Egypt. I visited Egypt 3 times in total, though as I don't handle non-Japanese foods very well, I brought with me instant ramen and bottled drinks. When I went out to do shopping, I'd run into vendors who tried to charge me prices inflated by a factor of 10 or even 20, without even batting an eye. Even though I was already aware of that practice, I was able to learn so much more by experiencing it myself. I set the climax of Jojo's 5th arc, Vento Oreo, in Rome, and performed extensive research in order to faithfully portray the city. Before going there in person, I studied how the city was built in depth, the geography and history, what kind of buildings were there, what the infrastructure was like, and more. I read travel guides and searched for pictures and committed as much of them as I could to memory. Then, when I had exhausted my research, I traveled to find things that weren't in the research, the things I wouldn't know I needed until I found them. As a result, the Rome I drew captured the real sights of the city, from the buildings to the traffic signals and signs, and the streets and the side streets and more. If you were to go to Rome and trace the path taken by the hero, Giorno, his allies, and the villain Diavolo from the Colosseum to the Tiber, I think you would find that I accurately captured the real distance. The map and a guidebook will help you gauge a distance, but looking at a map will always leave something unsaid that will pique your curiosity. Those answers will only be found in person. Most people assume you can now find anything you need to know on the internet, but many details will escape your awareness. For instance, the marking of the police cars, the shapes of the mailboxes, the uniforms worn by mail carriers, what the toilets are like, and so on, unless you go and observe them with your own eyes.
Yes, 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 all of that. King shit. King shit right there. Like, I agree wholeheartedly with everything Araki had to say about this because it is just simply true.
Yeah, authentic, subjective experience will give you so much. And if you can research the place or similar places to what you're doing, or like if you're writing about a certain job, if you can actually go and like talk to someone who is in that position. But I will say, so something that is obvious and something that I know like you and me, Gus, experience keenly as well as starving writers. Obviously, not all of us have the budget of an incredibly successful mangaka.
No. What I will say to that, too, taking multiple trips to Egypt and doing all that is something that, after writing the first two parts of Jojo, and I don't know how much research went into, like, England or America, just kind of spitballing it less
Yeah.
is the general vibe I'm getting is far less than Stardust Crusaders, which was clearly a labor of love informed by those trips. I think that like what we can take from it as people who definitely have like a lot more limited budgets is to become more interested in your general
Mm.
surroundings and be more fascinated by yourself, your own lived experiences and your parents' experiences, because while I do think that there is a utility and a significance to escapism as an audience member and as a person who's just trying to keep yourself together in really difficult times. Because when is it not difficult times? Escapism, I feel like, has a lot of draw for people. But I think escapism ends when you're creating a fiction. It turns out shallow if you don't acknowledge those parts of yourself that would inform something better.
It can be so easy to assume that your life is boring. But it truly is a case of the grass is always greener. In the no matter like what you think of the place you live and the like existence you lead, there are people out there who would find it so incredibly compelling if you were to produce it in that detail. I mean, we spoke on a recent SpongeBob Boys about the fact that, like, man, one of the most successful cartoons of all time is about a guy who is, like, a line cook. And that has captivated millions of children and
Yeah.
adults going on 30 years.
The beauty of that is combining that very mundane, relatable experience that a lot of people have and, find relatively boring, and then combining it with an authentic love of marine biology and sea creatures and just placing it in a novel setting. And a lot of stuff is like that. There is, like, an angle that you could give to something that is a day-to-day task that you've experienced, and it is just one novel decision away from being something like completely memorable to anybody else, something that they couldn't get enough of, something that they'd almost find aspirational.
Yeah, and I think it is just about finding that gold. Like, not slavishly reproducing every detail. Like, Araki even says in a later bit, don't use everything you research. Iceberg theory applies. In many ways, in my opinion, what research really gives you a lot of the time, rather than, like, myriad, like, countless details that you can use, is simply an ease and a confidence with your subject that will make writing easier. as well as more compelling on the back end.
If you're enamored with the Lord of the Rings, like, Peter Jackson movies, for example, and you see all of those exotic locales with those giant towering mountains and those deep, like, mystical forests and stuff, you maybe don't have to go to the countries where they filmed those movies. Go for a walk in the snow sometimes. Go to a forest. Go to, like, even a large hill if it's nearby you. The original works of Tolkien, were told about the English countryside, and in many ways, a connection with the nature that is around you is as much getting, like, immersed in the energies behind a setting like Middle-earth as, like, going to, like, the set of a film would be. It's more personal to you, because it's happening to you. All the way back when we were talking about, like, outside influences, you mustn't be afraid to work laterally the way that Araki saw statues and the way they posed and connected that to Michael Jackson. Use what you know, what you like, what experiences you have, and then just think, like, all right, well, how could that be different? Or how is this experience I've had like this experience I've had? Or this thing I've observed like this thing I've observed? Curiosity really is the key to all of this. Curiosity and true experience. And not feeling like you're too good for any of it.
And in the interest of bringing all of these ideas together, we have one more tip on the final fundamental pillar. Last thing I'm going to say is everything we have said today in this either almost or over 3 hour video, depending on how much we have to say about that last thing, this is still only scratching the surface of what is in this book. I skipped over a huge and like fantastically written and illustrated section on the art itself, where he breaks down Jojo's panels and like explains different things. Like there are a huge number of visual assets, which obviously me and Gus, as people who are like writers and not visual artists, wouldn't have been nearly as qualified to speak on. But there is such a tremendous degree of value you will get from actually getting your hands on this book, even if you're just like renting it from the library or like renting it online. Please try and get your hands on it if you've enjoyed this video, because this, if anything, has just kind of been the broad strokes. There is so much like really excellent wisdom and inspiration that you'd really be missing out on if you didn't try to hunt this down.
Exactly. So that is our full recommendation from this. Henry, this has been incredible. Bring us home, buddy.
So the last is Araki on theme. And there are 3 sections here. Ultimately, they are so intertwined, and the ending section, I think, will just be a perfect ending to this video. But we'll take it section by section, because I think he has so many good points here. So, it begins with, don't let your themes become muddled. He says, themes, in another sense, are how the creator views the world, and what he or she considers ideal ways to live. The author's goal is to embed them in the root of the work and to endeavor to keep them firmly in place. For example, Kochikame's consistent theme is the depiction of everyday commotions created by a childish policeman. The mangaka never attempts to send Ryo-san out on an adventure away from his post in Kamiari just because the adventure manga genre was popular at the time. At most, Ryo-san goes on a vacation every now and then, and even then, the stories deal with day-to-day. The greatness of Kochikame is that its theme has remained consistent throughout the decades. Let's say you create a soccer manga, and what you truly want are to depict the friendship shared by the young players, but your manga doesn't find the popularity you had hoped. Your editor comes to you and says, what's popular right now are manga with detailed depictions of complex soccer strategies, and you need to make the manga more about that. If you let your theme of friendship become muddled, your manga will fail. If that happens, you might lose some confidence in your manga and never be able to put it right again. If you're ever in that situation, you need to think long and hard about what you want to draw. In this example, whether you want to draw a manga about friendship or about the strategy of soccer, and keep that theme firm in your heart. Whether or not you can succeed at that depends on how strongly you believe in your theme. This might be a difficult task for those who are still lacking in life experiences. When a theme becomes muddled, it's a sign that the mangaka's own approach to life is unsteady. Until that is made firm, the mangaka is unable to hold a persistent theme. If in the end the theme isn't working out, scattershot attempts at making changes won't help. All you can do is start from the beginning. Shore up your theme, seek new avenues of development, and find your way through your situation.
Yeah, no, I think that he's 100% right on that because a theme cannot be like flimsy or vague. Like, I think by definition, a theme in the story can't suffuse anything unless it really is an idea that everything else we're seeing feels like it's building on it. If it's not defined, it's not a theme, essentially, or at least it's not a theme worth paying attention to. And ultimately, the audience will probably find a different theme in there.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's something that needs to, as he's saying, be fundamentally based in your ethos, in your views about life. Something me and Gus often used to make fun of is we got this really like bizarre long comment from someone whose name we wouldn't even share if we knew because we, don't want to like dunk on them as a person. And it's if you've ever heard us reference like a planet eater and a clan of wizards, that's what that was from. And they brought up like things that deal with themes like how far is too far and something like that. It's
Yeah.
such a non-theme because it's such a vague, like airy fairy philosophical question that it ultimately couldn't in any way deal with a like sincere belief. Let's for a second think about some like really popular movies and we'll break down the theme in real time. One's from recent years. Sinners. Sinners is a movie about how, in different forms, white supremacist culture tries to co opt or destroy black forms of expression, which in it is represented by the fact that Remick, the like vampire who has his hive mind, desperately wants to turn Sammy so he can take Sammy's blues, a like fundamentally culturally black art, and make it his own, or on the other end, that the members of the KKK that are secretly like the kind of landowners and police and people want to straight up come in and murder the Smokestack brothers and all the other revelers at the Juke joint. Another one recently, Nope, which Meg, friend of the channel and frequent contributor, made a really cool video essay about, is fundamentally a movie about the fact that audiences that indiscriminately consume whatever media is put in front of them and just want more, enable abuse and pain to go on behind the scenes. I saw the TV Glow is another good example because it is a movie about the tragedy of living inauthentically, being scared to experience the symbolic death of the life you have, even if it means not getting to live like your true self, the life that you should live. And these movies all work because clearly these are themes and ideas that Ryan Coogler, Jordan Peele, and Jane Schonbrun all like hold deeply in their like own lives and reflects their own experience as a black man making black art, B, a man who has worked for the better part of his life in the entertainment industry and been screwed over several times in the process, and a person who falls under the kind of non-binary trans umbrella as well. It's that ultimately these ideas and these themes have to come from your experience and your beliefs, and that is exactly why Araki says that people who have trouble with theme, often it comes from a lack of real life experience.
Yeah, or it's this like attempt to kind of gesture at something universal. Like the how far is too far example being this kind of like no one person, and especially not the person who would be writing that story, has a specific thing to say about how far is too far because it immediately begs the question of in terms of what? To what is that referring
Yeah,
to?
like
What thing are you passionate about to go far enough about that you would even consider that? Like that's more of a like functional like plot question than it is the thing underpinning that.
I think the difference can be clearly elucidated in, like, what would it be like to be the chosen one is, like, not a strong theme because, like, you're not the chosen one, because chosen ones don't exist in real life.
On the other hand, you could say, what is it like to be a gifted child who, in later in life, does not feel like you're adequately equipped to handle the adult world or explore its themes? That could be used metaphorically in a chosen one story to create a genuine theme that you believe in. That, like, expectations of society and your inability to meet them, or this belief that you should meet them despite how high in the sky they are, and maybe they've never been met, that's something. That's, like, a real experience that potentially you
Yeah, that can
had.
then just be filtered through the conventions of fiction in the same way that I'm pretty sure that Ryan Coogler has probably never been attacked by a group of ancient Irish vampires.
All of these things can be broken down to, like, just their sort of like baser elements. Sinners is someone is trying to eat me. I saw the TV glow is something doesn't want me to be myself. Nope is everyone wants to look at me, so I might as well be a spectacle.
Yeah, it's so true. And again, it's another reason why you can see we've pulled so many different examples from different like forms of media. You gotta keep taking this stuff in and you gotta keep living your life and living your life actively and having opinions on it. Which I think links nicely to this next thing where he talks about JoJo's and how like this kind of applies through that framework. The subheading is called A Paean to Humanity, Theme as a Product of Chance. JoJo's theme is a paean to humanity. In other words, an affirmation that mankind is wonderful. When the characters in JoJo are faced with adversity, they find a solution and forge a path onward by their own abilities, and never by some convenient coincidence. No god intervenes to save them, and no magic sword suddenly fall from the sky into their hands. To be honest, this idea of a paean to humanity was not a product of deep consideration or of wrestling over what I wanted to draw. It was a phrase I came up with lightly. I was told to write something for the inside flap of the first graphic novel, and I just happened to get the idea to write about the magnificence of mankind. At the time, I didn't mean much more by it than to say I'm not going to write a mecha manga where people fight using machines. But as I've continued to write about that theme over the years, I've come to see it as a subject with great depth. In hindsight, I can see what led me to that theme. When JoJo was just starting to be serialized, my grandfather passed away, and it made me think about how people die, but that some part of us is left. Some part of us is left behind to be passed on to the following generations. East of Eden, a work I deeply admired, also dealt with the theme of connections across generations, and at the time, everyone was talking about Roots, the American drama series. On the surface, the series appeared to be about slavery and racial discrimination, but as I watched it, I thought it was at heart a story about a family. When I started JoJo, I wanted to write about a battle between good and evil, but these influences led to me to make a series about passing the torch. If I had never come up with a paean to humanity as the theme, JoJo would have turned into something different. I might have found myself unable to find the ideas to get my characters out of the dangers in which I put them, thereby bringing my series to an early end.
Wow. And I had never actually heard that like phrase from him before, but it makes so much sense with like the way that JoJo became this multi-generational story, and that it does really feel like each generation gets acknowledged. Even, between parts 1 and 2, there is a character whose life is skipped over. He never gets the chance to be a protagonist, but we learn about him, and we learn about a private struggle that he sort of had, a small battle he fought in order to kind of like continue the values of the Joestar line. And it, like in that series, in that like kind of builds on itself throughout all of the JoJo's universe to create this real like solid theme of like family and that it matters. And the fact that Araki drew from his real life experiences for that, it makes me feel for some of the losses in my own life and my own connections with my own family and how that has informed my work. Like I cannot stress enough that the people around us are part of us and part of the reason we do art. Our connection to humanity, appropriately enough, are like the reason we are capable of making art that can affect other people.
I completely agree, and I think it is a testament to the fact that to be truly inspired, to be truly original, that you need to pull from everything around you. The things that went into the creation and solidification of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was obviously all the like manga and practice and everything that he had written up to that point, plus the passing of his grandfather, plus the John Steinbeck novel East of Eden, plus the like slavery miniseries with LeVar Burton roots. And you would not look at JoJo's Bizarre Adventure without that context and see any of that. But it's all there in the DNA.
Ultimately, like, nothing that is worth remembering as art comes from a rote recitation of art rules. There's always some humanity in there. There's always something that needs to be said that hasn't been said by any other piece of art because it's coming from a person who is drawing disparate connections that have never been made by any other mind.
It's true, because I think at the end of the day, all that trying to like use reverse engineered writing rules, even if, you know, you've for whatever reason obsessively gone through all the videos on this channel, tried to write down every piece of advice we've ever shared or given, and be like, yes, I will use these to construct my masterpiece. Believe me when I say that the drive to try and create almost the kind of like mathematically perfect piece of art, all you are going to get is a descent into madness.
Yeah, the joke's on you because all the things that we like said about like, characters and settings and like all that particular stuff about how to do them or what subjectively would be good, all of that stuff is really just saying there is a precedent for you being able to do this. But all the advice that we and everyone else gave that actually got you to sit down and made you form a routine and taught you how to write and when to write and how often to write and what to do to empower yourself to write honestly, well, that's the stuff that's going to keep you writing and maybe make that first category of stuff potentially useful.
Which I think brings us to the last thing from this book I'm going to read, and I think is something that is so valuable for everyone to hear in this like money poisoned capitalist world, in this bullshit online algorithm.
Too late
Yeah, this
capitalism.
fucking online algorithm pilled, corn unalive, brandable human TikTok Labubu Dubai wankfest.
Tongue, 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 Sahur.
The advice
Yeah.
is the mistake of choosing a theme based on what will sell. He says, I've already touched upon this, but it bears repeating. Without exception, a theme should reflect the creator's life. When deciding upon a theme, the one thing you absolutely must not do is choose one that doesn't interest you simply because it matches what's selling. Let's say you take a popular theme for your own work. When the trend passes, you'll be left with a theme that doesn't interest you, and as you begin to question why you're writing about it all, your manga will hit a wall. The most important questions for mangaka are, what do I want to draw, and why do I want to draw it? A brilliant person could read this book and use my advice to custom tailor a manga so that every element is optimized for popularity and appeal, and that mangaka might possibly come up with a calculated hit, but that will only work for a short term, maybe 3 years at best. From what I've seen and heard, that's about how long it takes before intellectual fatigue sets in. Then, when the manga's creation becomes rote, the readers will notice. If a mangaka draws out of a desire to have a hit, and the mangaka successfully finds a large audience, the creator's ambitions will be fulfilled. The passion to create will wane, and the manga will arrive at a dead end. The mangaka will begin searching for a new path and be beset with doubt. If you view creating manga as a temporary business endeavor, the result might be good enough for you. But if you want to pursue the royal road to being a mangaka, then I urge you to avoid that way of thinking. If you find a theme that interests you and connects with you on a personal or emotional level, even if you think that theme may be too dark to sell, you should resolve to create your manga around that theme. Your manga's success will not depend upon a seemingly sellable theme. Whatever your theme is, if it feels right to you, and you layer upon it characters and a story that move you, it will undoubtedly be an interesting work, and one that readers will welcome. I wish for anyone who wishes to be a mangaka to believe that which they feel is right, and to follow manga's royal road with determination.
Wow. Beautifully put. and genuine. When you get right down to it, Henry, you and I we're two writers. We've done it for work sometimes. We've been paid in various professional capacities for it. But the reason why we are two writers is because we have a lot of interesting ideas to us that lend themselves to this process of creation. We wouldn't be doing this as often as we do if there wasn't this compulsion to do it. Just to lay the record out, it's not like Henry and I are like sitting around waiting for someone to be like, hey, I got a new big check to send you in the mail for this next thing you're going to write, and then we think of an idea, and then we go through the whole writing
I
process.
fucking
No.
wish.
No, it's always with us. It is in us and it's inescapable, and we do it far more often than we would ever get paid for it. And with things that would never sell, would never be marketable. We have our front-facing projects that like are marketable to some extent. There are ideas that Henry and I have had, some good, some bad, that are just too weird for the public. And you will see some of those throughout our ongoing career finally, like, breach into the sunlight from the ocean of potentiality. But, like, the truth of the matter is, we're always going to be doing it, whether you see it or not. And chances are, there are people in this very audience, in this very comment section, who are exactly like that too. They're just writing and doing it and being interested in it, and they don't really care whether or not some studio someday down the line tells them this is your dream on the big
Yeah,
screen.
and I think at the end of the day, no matter what happens, whether you make $1 million or are always just doing it for the love of the game, you gotta keep following that royal road. You gotta do it for the art itself, and you gotta do it because you love it, which is not to say it will always be easy. In fact, sometimes you will feel like tearing your fucking hair out. Lord knows I do. I think I contemplate quitting at least once a week, but I know in my heart that I wouldn't be happy any other way. And I know that Araki wouldn't either. I know that Gus wouldn't, Meg wouldn't, Addison wouldn't, Jasper wouldn't, Charlie wouldn't, Zooey wouldn't, Rocky wouldn't. None of the people who we work with would be happy if they were told, I'm going to send you like a stipend of money to not create every week. It wouldn't happen. And if the same is true of you, if the SCP Foundation and Dio Brando couldn't stop you from creating, then you are a friend of ours. And we're glad you're here. And we so deeply appreciate that you sat through a long ass video about the writing advice of Hirohiko Araki, creator of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, from his fantastic book, Manga in Theory and Practice, The Craft of Creating Manga. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have gone to go check out Killjam Triple X and the Kingmaker Histories to see what we're always ranting about, thank you for that as well. If you've subscribed to us here on the Warner channel or joined us on Patreon, thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's all keep on this royal road together, because it's the only way to live, baby.
And we will see you on the royal road.